Claire! Claire!
The scrape of metal against concrete. That was the first sound. A maintenance worker lifting a hatch cover on the sidewalk outside the Langham Hotel. The sound cut through the October air like something being opened that was meant to stay closed. Claire Hargrove was 20 feet away. She was carrying dry cleaning. 2 bags, Grant's suits. The charcoal one he needed for Thursday's board dinner, and the navy one he wore to quarterly presentations because he believed it projected confidence without arrogance. She knew these things about him. After 9 years, she knew everything about him, or she had believed she did. The October air smelled like the lake, cold and gray, and alive in the way Chicago air is alive in autumn. Her back hurt. It had been hurting for 3 weeks. 8 months of pregnancy will do that. 8 months of carrying something enormous inside your body while the rest of your life continues at its usual pace will do that. She shifted the dry cleaning to her left hand. Her right hand pressed briefly against the small of her back. She was tired. The specific flattening tiredness that had become her normal. She could not remember what not tired felt like. She had stopped trying to remember. The hotel's side entrance opened. Not the main doors. Not the lobby entrance with the brass handles and the doorman who knew Grant by name. The side entrance. The one that opened onto the service corridor. The one that guests used when they did not want to walk through the lobby. Grant came through the door first. He was laughing. She registered the laugh before she registered the woman beside him. She knew his laugh. She could identify it in a crowded room in the dark at distance. 9 years. She knew every version of it. This was the version he used when he was entirely comfortable, entirely at ease. The laugh of a man who believed the world was arranged correctly. His hand was on the small of a woman's back. The woman had dark hair, a green coat. She was looking up at him with an expression that Claire recognized instantly. She had worn that expression herself 6 years ago. Before she understood that expressions, like everything else, have an expiration date. The woman was looking at Grant the way a person looks at someone they believe loves them. Claire stood very still. The dry cleaning bags were in her hand. The October air was cold against her face. The maintenance worker had moved a few steps away from the open hatch and was working with something on the sidewalk beside it. A bus went past on the street. Someone a block away was laughing. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon in a city that did not know or care what was happening on this particular sidewalk. She watched Grant open the passenger door of a car parked at the curb. Not his car. His car was a black Mercedes. This was a silver rental. A deliberate choice. A car that could not be traced to him by anyone who recognized his plates. She noted this in the way she noted everything. Precisely, quietly. The way an urban planner notes a structural inconsistency in a building. The way a woman who has spent 9 years watching carefully notes the things that do not fit. His hand lingered on the woman's arm as she got in. The tenderness in that gesture was the specific tenderness of long familiarity. This was not new. The way he touched her said clearly, this is not the first time. This is not even the 100th time. This is simply what we do. And then Grant looked up. He saw Claire. The distance between them was perhaps 15 feet, close enough to see his face clearly, close enough to watch it change. She had expected guilt. She had expected the naked, unmanaged guilt of a man who has been caught, the color draining from his face, the collapse of composure, something real and honest and human breaking through. What she saw instead was calculation, a fraction of a second, barely visible. But she had spent 9 years watching this face. She knew every movement it made. She knew the way his eyes shifted slightly to the left when he was constructing a response. She knew the particular stillness of his jaw when he was deciding what version of himself to offer. He calculated before he felt guilty. He was already building the response before the reality had fully landed. That fraction of a second was the thing that broke something open in Claire. Not the affair. Not the woman in the green coat. Not the rental car chosen to avoid recognition. The calculation. The calculation that said, even now, even in this moment, I am thinking about how to manage you. The maintenance worker returned to the open hatch. He had a coiled pressure hose lying across the sidewalk, the kind used for clearing street-level drainage blockages. The hatch was still open. The hose was connected to a pressure point. Claire did not decide what happened next. She told people this for years. She was not entirely sure they believed her. She was not entirely sure she believed herself. But her hands moved. The dry cleaning bags dropped, both of them. Hit the sidewalk, the charcoal suit, the navy suit, both of them on the ground. And her hands found the hose. It happened approximately 4 seconds. The sound was significant. A wet, unambiguous, completely undeniable sound. Grant Hargrove and the woman in the green coat were drenched in the specific, particular, unmistakable reality of Chicago street drainage. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, on a public sidewalk outside the Langham Hotel, the woman made a sound that Claire would later feel guilty about. A sharp, genuine cry of shock. Grant made no sound at all. He stood there, soaked, looking at his wife. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned around. She walked to her car. It was parked half a block away. She walked the entire half block without looking back. Her hands were shaking. She could feel it in her fingers, in her wrists, all the way up her arms, a fine, continuous tremor that had nothing to do with cold. The car. She reached the car. She used 2 hands to get the key in. First attempt failed. Second attempt, the lock gave. She got inside. She closed the door. She pressed the lock button. The sound of the street disappeared into the particular silence of an enclosed car. Her hands went to the steering wheel, both of them, flat against it. Pressing hard enough that she could feel the texture of the leather through her palms, the baby kicked. One solid, decisive movement against her ribs, as if to say, still here, still here. Keep going. Claire sat there. She did not start the car. She did not cry. She did not move. She watched through the windshield as a woman walked past with a stroller. An ordinary woman in an ordinary coat, pushing a sleeping baby in the October afternoon. The woman did not look up. She had somewhere to be. Her life was unbroken and she did not know it, and she walked past and was gone. Claire watched until she was out of sight. Then she picked up her phone. Helen answered on the second ring. "I need to come over," Claire said. "I'll explain when I get there." She heard the pause on Helen's end, the pause of someone who knows better than to ask questions in this particular tone of voice. "Doors open," Helen said. Claire pulled out of the parking space. She drove north. She did not turn on the radio. She drove in silence. She drove past 6 city blocks before she realized she had not set a direction. She corrected. She turned north. Helen's apartment was on the north side. She knew this. She knew the route. She had driven it 100 times. She could drive it unconscious. She could drive it while the world fell apart. She did both at once. The apartment building was an old 3-flat in Andersonville. Helen had lived there for 7 years. She had a small balcony that faced west, and a kitchen that smelled permanently of whatever she was cooking, and a spare room with a fold-out bed that Claire had slept in 3 times across their 18-year friendship. 3 times. She counted them as she parked. Once after a fight with Grant that she had never told Helen the full details of. Once after her mother's surgery scare 2 years ago. Once after the miscarriage. The miscarriage. She sat with that thought for a moment. Then she got out of the car. Helen was waiting in the kitchen. The apartment was warm. Something had been cooking earlier, the ghost of garlic and olive oil still in the air. Helen had made tea. It was already steeping when Claire walked in. Helen looked at her face. She did not say anything. She pointed at the couch. Claire sat. She still had her coat on, the cream wool coat. She did not take it off. She told Helen what happened. The side entrance. The hand on the small of the back, the rental car, the calculation on his face, the hose. When she got to the hose, something happened to Helen's expression that Claire had never seen before. A very specific combination of emotions that she could not entirely name. There was shock in it, and something that was not quite laughter but was adjacent to it, and something harder and older underneath both of those. "Tell me everything," Helen said, "from the beginning. Not just today. I thought today was the beginning." "I know," Helen said. "I know you did." She got up. She went to the kitchen drawer, the one beside the refrigerator, that was slightly harder to open than the others. She pulled out a folder. It was not a large folder, manila. Well used. The edges slightly soft with age. She set it on the coffee table between them. Claire looked at it. Then she looked at Helen. "How long have you had this?" she asked. 2 years, Helen said. "Sit there. Don't move." She sat down across from Claire. There she opened the folder. Inside, receipts photographed on a phone. A restaurant name Claire did not recognize. A woman's name on a reservation record. 3 dates, 3 locations, meticulously noted. In Helen's handwriting, which was the handwriting of a nurse, small and exact and unambiguous. "Helen, I know. You've had this for 2 years." "I know, Claire. Why didn't you?" "Because every time I almost said something, you were happy." Helen looked at her steadily. "Or I thought you were happy. Or he had just done something that made you seem happy, and I convinced myself I was wrong about what I'd seen. I convinced myself I was making something out of nothing. I convinced myself it wasn't my place." She paused. "I was wrong to convince myself of those things. I know that. I have known it for 2 years. You can be angry with me if you need to be." Claire looked at the folder. "What restaurant is this?" Helen told her the name. "A place in the Gold Coast. Expensive, the kind of restaurant where people go when they are celebrating something." "When was this?" Helen told her the date. Claire went very still. That date. She knew that date. She had spent that evening alone in the Lincoln Park house. Grant had said he was having dinner with a client who was in from New York. He had come home at 11:30. He had been cheerful. He had kissed her on the temple and said he was tired and gone to the guest room because he did not want to wake her. She had thought he was being considerate. "I need a lawyer," Claire said. Her voice was completely steady. It surprised her. She had expected her voice to shake the way her hands had shaken. But her voice came out even and certain and clear. "A good one," she added. "Not someone he knows, not someone connected to him or the firm." Helen reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She set a business card on the coffee table, beside the folder. Precise and deliberate. Warren Aldridge. Family law, a North Michigan Avenue address. "I called him 6 months ago," Helen said quietly, "just to have the number." In case. Claire picked up the card. She turned it over. The back was blank. "You called a divorce lawyer 6 months ago." "For me. I was hoping you'd never need it," Helen said. "I was also making sure it was there if you did." The tea was still steeping. The apartment was warm. The ghost of garlic and olive oil in the air. The specific quality of quiet that happens after something enormous is said out loud. Claire set the card down on top of the folder. She placed her hand on her stomach. The baby moved. That low, rolling prayer that had become the most reliable thing in her life over the past months. Whatever else was true or false or complicated. The baby moved. That part was real. "I'm going to stay here tonight," Claire said. "I know," Helen said. "I already changed the sheets in the spare room." She lay awake until 3 in the morning. The spare room was quiet. The window faced the building next door. The fold-out bed was comfortable enough. Helen had put an extra pillow on it and left a glass of water on the nightstand and turned the hall light on low and did all the things she had always done and did not say anything else, and that was exactly right. Claire lay on her back, both hands on her stomach. The baby was quiet now. The city outside was mostly quiet, too. The occasional car, someone's music very far away. She stared at the ceiling. She went back through the last 3 years, the way you go through a house after something is lost, methodically, carefully, not looking for one specific thing, looking for what she might have missed. The Florence trip, their anniversary. He had been distracted the entire time. She had put it down to stress about a deal he was closing. She had not asked too many questions because she had learned somewhere along the way. She had learned not to ask too many questions. When had she learned that? She could not identify the exact moment. It had been gradual, incremental, the way water shapes stone. Not a single blow, but 1,000 small moments of erosion. The birthday dinner where he stepped outside to take a call and was gone for 23 minutes. She had counted. She had sat at the table alone and counted. And when he came back, she had smiled and not said anything about the 23 minutes. The weekend he was at a conference in New York. The weekend she was 8 weeks pregnant and terrified and alone. She had been alone because he was not in New York. She pressed her hands harder against her stomach. The baby moved. "Good, keep moving. We are both still here." She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was shallow and gray, and she woke with the thin October light coming through the window and the sound of Helen already moving in the kitchen. She lay there for a moment. Then she sat up. She reached for the business card on the nightstand. She had brought it in with her. She had not left it on the coffee table. She looked at it. Warren Aldridge. Family law. She set it face up on the pillow beside her. She looked at it while she put on her shoes. She looked at it while she found her phone. She looked at it for a long moment before she picked it up and carried it out to the kitchen. Helen was making eggs. She did not say good morning. She just pointed at the coffee. Claire poured a cup. She sat at the kitchen table. She put the business card in front of her. She dialed the number at 8:15 in the morning. The receptionist answered on the third ring, Warren Aldridge's office. "My name is Claire Hargrove," she said. "I need to speak with Mr. Aldridge. I need to speak with him today." The folder was on the kitchen table. Helen had brought it from the living room and set it between them while Claire ate the eggs she had not asked for and was grateful for. The folder sat between the coffee cups like something that had been waiting a long time to be opened all the way. "Tell me about the first time you noticed something," Claire said. Helen looked up from her own cup. "Which time do you want?" "The first time. There were a lot of first times, Helen." Helen set her cup down. She wrapped both hands around it. She looked at the folder. "The charity gala," she said, "October. 14 months ago." Claire went still. The charity gala. She remembered it clearly. A benefit for a children's hospital foundation. They had attended as one of the top-tier donors. She had worn a deep red dress. Grant had complimented it. He had been warm that evening. Attentive. She remembered thinking he seemed like himself again. She remembered being glad. She had sat at their table most of the evening. He had circulated the way he always did at events like this. It was part of what they did. She held the table. He worked the room. It had always been this way. What happened at the gala? Claire asked. Helen opened the folder. She pulled out her phone. She scrolled for a moment. She turned the screen to face Claire. A photograph. Taken in a hallway, the lighting dim. Two people in formal clothes. The man's face was turned slightly away from the camera, but Claire had spent 9 years memorizing that face. She knew it in every light. She knew it in the dark. His hand was on the woman's face. The way a man touches a woman he has been touching for a long time. The specific practiced tenderness of familiarity, of routine, of something that has existed long enough to have its own gravity. The woman was wearing a green dress. Not the same woman as yesterday's green coat, but the same woman. Claire recognized the shape of her, the dark hair, the way she stood. You took this, Claire said. I was looking for a bathroom, Helen said. I turned the wrong corner. I took the picture before I thought about whether I should. Instinct. And then you kept it. For 14 months. The charity gala, October, 14 months ago. Claire was 3 months pregnant at that point. She had not told anyone except Grant. They had decided to wait. She had been anxious about the pregnancy. Anxious in the particular way of someone who had already lost one. She had spent that whole evening trying not to be anxious, trying to enjoy the evening, trying to believe that this time things were going well. And he was in a hallway with his hand on Naomi Reed's face. And her husband came back to the table, and he was warm and attentive, and she thought, he seems like himself again. Because he had been with Naomi Reed, and he was relieved, not guilty, relieved. He had had what he needed, and he was ready to be her husband again for the rest of the evening. There's something else, Helen said. She reached back into the folder. She pulled out a single piece of paper, a printout of a text message, photographed from her own phone, sent to her by a mutual acquaintance who had assumed Helen would want to know. It was a screenshot of a private social media message from Naomi Reed to a friend, dated 6 months ago. Claire read it. She read it twice. He says the marriage has been over for years. He says they stay together for appearances. He says she knows and she's fine with it. She set the paper down on the table. She knows and she's fine with it. She knows and she's fine with it. She picked up her coffee cup. It was empty. She held it anyway. The ceramic was still warm. She focused on that. The warmth of an empty cup. I know and I'm fine with it. He told Naomi Reed that she knew. He had built a fiction in which Claire was a willing participant in her own humiliation, in which she had agreed, somehow, to be a wife in name only while he conducted his real life elsewhere, in which the arrangement was mutual and understood. He had told Naomi Reed this so that Naomi Reed would not feel like the other woman, so that Naomi would feel like the real choice, the chosen one, the woman he actually wanted. He had used Claire as the lie that made Naomi comfortable. She put the coffee cup down very carefully. She placed it precisely on the table. She moved it 1 millimeter to the left, then 1 millimeter back. He told her I knew, she said. Yes, he told her it was an arrangement. Yes, he made me complicit. Without asking me. Without telling me, he made me part of the story he told her. She paused. So she wouldn't feel bad about herself. Claire, he managed her conscience, Claire said, using me. He used my supposed knowledge as the thing that made it okay for her. Her voice was still even. Still that strange, steady evenness that had arrived yesterday and had not left. Inside, something was moving. Something large and cold, shifting slowly in deep water. Not up yet. Not at the surface yet. But moving. She checked her phone, not for a specific reason. Just that thing you do, lock, unlock, lock again. No message from Grant. Of course no message. What would he even say? She put the phone face down on the table. Call Warren Aldridge, Helen said. Called the office this morning. Call him back, go see him today. I already set an appointment. Noon. Helen looked at her. Something moved across her face. Relief, maybe. The relief of someone who has been holding something too long. I should have told you sooner, Helen said. You said that already. I know. I'm going to keep saying it. Then say it and let it sit, Claire said. Don't ask me to absolve you right now. I don't have the energy. Fair, Helen said. She picked up her coffee cup. What do you need to do before noon? Claire thought about it. I need to call my mother, she said. She picked up her phone. She dialed. Dot answered on the second ring. Her mother always answered on the second ring. She had been doing it since the invention of personal mobile phones. Claire, her mother's voice. Warm and direct and slightly worried in the specific way it got when she heard something she did not like in the first syllable. You sound like you haven't slept. I haven't. Is it the baby? Should I come? Not yet, Mom. That means yes, Dot said. That has always meant yes when you say it that way. It means I'm handling something and I'll need you soon but not today. A pause. Her mother was a retired school teacher. She had spent 35 years reading rooms full of children who were pretending to be fine. "I'll be there tomorrow," Dot said. "Don't argue." "Mom." "I'm not asking," Dot said. "I'm telling you. I'm packing a bag after this call. You can explain everything tomorrow morning." Claire closed her eyes for a moment. Something in her chest loosened. Just slightly. Just enough. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. I'm your mother. This is what I do." She hung up. She set the phone down. She looked at Helen. "She's coming tomorrow," she said. "Of course she is," Helen said. She got up to refill her coffee. "You want more tea?" "Yes," Claire said. And Helen, "Don't tell me I'm going to be okay." "Not yet. I know you want to. Just don't." Helen set the kettle on. She did not turn around. "Okay," she said. "I won't." Warren Aldridge's office was on the 14th floor of a building on North Michigan Avenue. The waiting room had gray carpet and 3 chairs and a window that looked out at the lake. The lake was doing what it always did in October. Being large. Being gray. Being completely indifferent to human circumstances. Claire liked it. The indifference. The scale of it. She sat in one of the gray chairs. She had arrived 11 minutes early. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her coat still on. The receptionist brought water without being asked. Warren Aldridge came out to meet her at exactly noon. He was compact in his early 50s, a gray suit that fit well. The specific quality of stillness that people develop when they have spent decades in rooms full of very loud pain. He shook her hand. He noticed the dry cleaning bag she was not carrying. He noticed the coat she had not taken off. He noticed her posture. He said nothing. He led her into his office, the same view of the lake. 2 chairs across a desk, a small side table, a box of tissues that had clearly been there for a long time and was almost empty. "Tell me why you're here," he said. She told him. She told him everything in approximately 35 minutes. She spoke without stopping except once, when she needed a moment after the part about the miscarriage and the charity gala and the dates. Warren listened without interrupting. He did not take notes. He watched her face. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Then he asked, "Do you have a prenuptial agreement?" "Yes." "Do you know what is in it?" "I signed it 9 years ago. Grant's attorneys drafted it. I had my own attorney review it at the time." "Your own attorney?" "Yes, a friend of my father's. A general practice lawyer in Ohio who did not specialize in family law but who Grant said was sufficient." Warren was quiet for one beat. "Do you know if the agreement has an infidelity clause?" "Grant told me it did not. He said it was purely asset division, standard structure. He said the infidelity clause was something his first draft had included, but that his attorneys removed it because it was too invasive and they wanted to start the marriage on a foundation of trust." She heard herself say those words, foundation of trust. Warren's left eyebrow moved. She clocked it. She would come to understand that this was his version of a full emotional display. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "it would be worth our time to read it together." "Do you have it?" "I requested it from the law firm that filed it this morning. When your office called and gave me your name, I pulled everything I could access before noon." He opened the folder on his desk. "I have a copy." He set it on the desk between them. She looked at the document. She had not seen it since the day she signed it. She recognized the typeface, the specific quality of the paper, the formality of the margins. She picked it up. She read. She found the infidelity clause on page 7. It was not removed. It was present, clear, specific. In the event of documented marital infidelity by either party, the offending party forfeits all rights to assets accumulated during the marriage beyond the agreed base division, and is further required to pay a structured settlement to the non-offending party. She read it 3 times. She set the document down. "He said this was removed," she said. "It was not removed," Warren said. "He told me." She stopped. She started again. "He looked me in the eyes 9 years ago and told me that clause was not in this document. He told you that." "He told me that." Warren's expression did not change. He was not a man who expressed things with his face. He expressed things with the quality of his attention, which was complete. She had never had anyone's full attention the way Warren Aldridge gave it. "The clause is symmetrical," he said. "It applies to either party. He may have included it originally to protect himself against you. What he failed to consider was that it also protects you against him." "He forgot which direction it cut," Claire said. "Or he was confident it would never be tested." She sat with that for a moment. 9 years. She had spent 9 years operating inside a legal document she had never fully read because her husband had told her she did not need to. She had trusted him with the fine print. She had trusted him with the fine print of her own life. Inside, in the place where the cold thing was moving, God, I was so stupid. The signs were all there. She stopped herself from finishing that thought. No, not stupid. Trusting. There is a difference. He made it feel like the same thing. That was his skill. making trust and stupidity feel identical so that when the trust was violated, you blamed yourself. She took a breath. What do I need, she said, to activate this clause? What documentation? Warren folded his hands on the desk. Documented infidelity. That means more than one witness and more than one piece of evidence. It means a paper trail or testimony that can withstand legal scrutiny. I have my best friend's folder, she said. 2 years of documented observations. Receipts. Dates. Locations. Warren nodded once. I have a text message screenshot, she said, from the other woman to a friend, in which she describes what he told her about the marriage. Another nod. And I have a voicemail that I haven't listened to yet. From Naomi Reed. She called while I was in your waiting room. You have not listened to it, not yet. Would you like to do that now? He asked. Or would you like to hear what else I found this morning first? What else did you find? Warren opened the folder to a different section. Hargrove Capital is a private equity firm with publicly traded fund vehicles. In reviewing publicly accessible records this morning, I found that 6 weeks ago, a secondary limited liability company was filed under the Hargrove name. Hargrove Venture Holdings IV. She looked at the document he slid toward her. He moved assets, she said. It appears that approximately $14 million has been transferred into this new entity over the past 6 weeks. 6 weeks ago, she had been 32 weeks pregnant. He had been reorganizing the financial structure of the marriage. Is that legal? She asked. It depends on when it was done, and whether it constitutes the dissipation of marital assets. If the transfers occurred while you were still legally in the marriage and were made without your knowledge or consent for the purpose of reducing your legal entitlement, they may not be. He paused. Which is why I have already drafted a motion for financial disclosure. If you would like me to file it. She looked at him. How quickly can you file it? Today, he said. If you'd like. She picked up her phone. She found the voicemail. She pressed play and held the phone out so they could both hear it. Naomi Reed's voice filled the space between them. It was not what Claire expected. She had expected defensiveness, calculation, the voice of someone managing a situation. What she heard was a voice that was frightened, young in a way that did not match the composed professional woman she had seen briefly the afternoon before. A voice at the edge of something it was not sure how to cross. Mrs. Hargrove. I'm not going to ask you to forgive anything. I just need you to know that I didn't know about the pregnancy until Tuesday. I swear to you I did not know. And I don't think you're crazy. I never thought you were crazy. He told me he said the marriage had been over for years. He said you both agreed to a pause. I think I've been lied to too. The voicemail ended. The office was very quiet. Warren was looking at the window, at the lake. She didn't know, Claire said. It sounds that way. He told her I knew. He told her we had an arrangement. She stopped. He built a whole story. For her. Using me as the foundation. So she wouldn't feel bad, Mrs. Hargrove. Warren turned from the window. I want to ask you something. And I want you to take your time answering. She waited. Do you want to call her back? She looked at him. If she is willing to document what she has told you in that message, he said carefully, it becomes another piece of evidence. Her account of what he told her, the specific misrepresentations he made. She would be testifying against him. She would be documenting her own experience, which happens to be relevant to yours. Claire looked down at the folder, the document, the clause that had been there all along, the fine print she had trusted him to explain. She had trusted him with the fine print. She was done doing that. File the financial disclosure motion, she said. To done, he said, and yes, I'll call her back. She stood up. She picked up her coat. She had still not taken it off the entire meeting. She was almost at the door when something settled inside her. Quiet. Declarative. In the elevator, going down, alone with the gray walls and the soft mechanical hum, I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. Not a question. Not uncertainty searching for reassurance. A fact. Her fact. The first one that was entirely hers. The elevator opened onto the lobby. She walked out into the October air. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The lake was 2 blocks east. She could smell it. That cold, specific smell. She took out her phone. She found Naomi Reed's number. She stared at it. Then she pressed call. She went home. Helen had offered the spare room again. Her mother would arrive tomorrow. She could have spent the night in Andersonville with the fold-out bed and the wall facing the building next door. She chose to go home. The decision had a specific quality to it. Not bravado. Not defiance. Something more like the decision to look clearly at something before you turn away from it for good. She needed to see the house. She needed to walk through it with new eyes. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she decided what to do with it. The Lincoln Park house was a 4-story gray brick on a street of gray bricks. Grant had chosen it. He had presented it to her as a surprise during their first year of marriage. She had stood in the empty rooms and imagined what she would do with them, and felt a particular happiness that she now understood was the happiness of a woman who has been given a house to live in and has mistaken it for being given a home. She arrived at 11:30. Grant had not come home. She parked in the garage. She walked through the back entrance. She turned on the lights. As she went, she walked through every room. The hallway, the living room, the formal dining room that they used 4 times a year, the kitchen, the butler's pantry, the housekeeper's room on the garden level, the 3 guest rooms, the master bedroom, the study that had been hers briefly before it became a room. She rarely entered the nursery. She stopped outside the nursery door. She pressed her hand flat against the wood. She did not go in, not yet. She went to Grant's home office instead. She had not entered it without his invitation in 3 years. He had been specific about that. He needed the boundary. He needed a space that was entirely his. She had respected this because she had believed that respecting a person's boundaries was one of the ways love looked. She sat in his chair. It was expensive. Everything in this room was expensive. Not in a showy way. In the specific, understated way of a man who wants you to understand that his wealth is so complete that he does not need to demonstrate it. She opened the desk drawers. Not looking for evidence. Not yet. Warren was handling evidence. She was looking for something else. She was looking for the geography of a secret life conducted inside a house she had spent 4 years making beautiful. The first drawer, pens, paper clips, a phone charger in a specific brand she did not recognize, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a receipt from a florist for a delivery 2 months ago. The billing address was a Michigan Avenue apartment she did not know. She folded the receipt, put it in her coat pocket. The second drawer, files, financial documents, copies of documents she recognized and copies of documents she did not. She did not touch those. Warren had the financial disclosure motion in progress. The third drawer, personal items. A watch she had given him for his 40th birthday that he never wore. 2 cufflinks she had selected herself at a jeweler's on Oak Street. A photograph of the 2 of them from their honeymoon in Portugal. They were standing on a cliff above the Atlantic, and they were laughing. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She had been so happy. She had been genuinely, completely happy. She put the photograph face down in the drawer. She reached further back. Her hand found something small and rectangular. She pulled it out. A hotel key card. Not from the Langham, from the Waldorf Astoria. Dated 7 weeks ago. 7 weeks ago. She had been 33 weeks pregnant. He had told her he was in London for 2 days for a fund meeting. She held the key card. She looked at it. It was cream-colored with the hotel's name embossed in gold. An ordinary object. The kind of thing a person does not even register picking up. The kind of thing that accumulates in desk drawers across a life. Except she had a London trip in her phone calendar from 7 weeks ago. She had texts from him from 7 weeks ago saying he was stuck in meetings, sorry for the short responses, the time zone was exhausting. She had believed him. She put the key card in her coat pocket, beside the florist receipt. She did not know why she put it there. She just did. She sat in his chair for a few more minutes, looking at the room, looking at the bookshelves with the books arranged by color that she had helped choose because she had read somewhere that it made rooms feel more considered, looking at the framed abstract prints that she had sourced because they felt right for the space, looking at the desk lamp she had bought for his birthday 3 years ago. She had made this room beautiful. She had made every room in this house beautiful. She had been the keeper of it, the manager of it, the person who understood exactly how all of it worked and needed almost nothing in return, and had told herself that needing nothing was a kind of strength. She had made his entire life beautiful. And he had been in a hotel in Chicago for 2 days while she was at 33 weeks pregnant and trusting him. She heard the front door. She did not move from the chair. His footsteps on the hardwood. The familiar sequence. Front door, closet, 2 steps, living room. Toward the kitchen probably, and then he saw the light under the office door. He stopped. She heard him stop. Then he knocked, twice. "Light, Claire? Come in," she said. He opened the door. He looked at her, sitting in his chair, her coat on, her hands in her lap. He had changed his clothes. He was wearing a different shirt. He had showered. He had come home from being drenched in sewer water on a public sidewalk, and he had showered and changed his clothes. And now he was standing in his office doorway with his face arranged carefully into the expression of a man who would like to be reasonable about something. She watched him arrange it. "Claire," he said, "what happened today was—" "I know what it was," she said. "I saw what it was. I know how it looked." "I know how it was," she said, "not how it looked." He took a breath. He moved into the room. He sat in the chair across from his own desk. The guest chair. He was a guest in his own office because she was in his chair and she had not offered to move. This has been blown, he started. Complete that sentence, she said. I'd like to hear how you complete it. He stopped. He recalibrated. I'd like us to talk, he said, like adults. I am an adult, she said. I'm also 8 months pregnant. I'm also your wife. I'm also the person you told a prenuptial agreement had no infidelity clause. Something moved across his face. Just briefly. What, the infidelity clause, she said. Page 7. It was there when I signed it. I read it this afternoon with my attorney. Warren Aldridge of Aldridge Family Law in North Michigan. You may not know him, I made sure of that. He was quiet. The quality of his quiet changed. She watched it change. The managing, calculating quiet became something different. Something that recognized it was in a different kind of room than it had expected. Claire, I'm going to bed, she said. You can sleep in the guest room. She stood up. She was 8 months pregnant and getting out of a desk chair was not effortless, but she managed it. She walked past him. She did not hurry. She did not run. She stopped in the doorway. She did not turn around. Don't call anyone tonight, she said. Don't call your attorneys. Don't call Oliver. Don't call your mother. Don't call anyone and tell them anything about what happened today until I've had the chance to talk to mine. She paused. That's not a request. She walked out of the room. She went upstairs. She went to the master bathroom. She turned the shower on. The water hit the tile and the sound filled the room. She sat on the cold tile floor, still in her coat, and she cried. She cried the way you cry when you have been holding it for a very long time. Without elegance, without quiet, without the kind of crying that happens when you believe someone might hear. The shower covered the sound. That was the point. That had always been the point, in this house, on the nights when she needed to cry and did not want anyone to know she was crying. She had done this in this bathroom before, more times than she had let herself count. She sat on the cold tile and she cried until there was nothing left, and then she sat there a little longer and listened to the water. Then she got up, she took off her coat. She got in the shower. She stood under the hot water for a long time. When she got out, the house was very quiet. She went to bed in the master bedroom. She left the light on in the hallway. She lay on her back with her hands on her stomach. The baby moved, long and slow, like something stretching. Good, she thought. I know. I know we're okay. We're going to be okay. She was not sure she believed it yet, but she said it. She said it to the baby and to the ceiling, and to the particular darkness of a house that had always been a little more his than hers. She said it until she fell asleep. Morning came in through the east-facing windows with the flat white light of a cloudy October day. Grant was not in the master bedroom. She had not expected him to be. She heard him distantly somewhere in the house below, the coffee machine. The specific sound it made when it finished a cycle. She lay still for a moment. She had slept 5 hours. She felt it. She got up. She did not go downstairs to the kitchen. She went to the window and looked out at the backyard, the oak tree she had fought to keep when they were doing the landscape redesign 2 years ago. She had fought for it because it was old and she believed old things deserved defending. Grant had thought it interfered with the sight lines from the dining room window. She had won that particular argument. The tree still had some of its leaves, the October ones, rust and golden brown. Most of them would be gone by next week. She went to her phone, 8:15. She called Warren's office. He had already received the confirmation from the court on the financial disclosure motion. It was filed, processing. She dressed. She went down to the kitchen. Grant had made coffee. She could smell it from the stairs. She stopped on the landing, the smell of morning coffee in that house. She had breathed that smell for 9 years. She had associated it with mornings that felt like safety. She stood on the landing for a moment. Then she went down. She walked past the kitchen without stopping. She went to the small pantry off the kitchen where she kept her own box of tea. She filled the kettle. She boiled it. She made tea. She took her tea to the kitchen island. She sat. Grant was in the living room. She could see him through the doorway. He was looking at his phone. He did not look up. She took out a legal pad from the drawer beside the island. Her own legal pad. She had kept a stack of them there for years. She used them for household management, the lists and schedules and renovations notes that kept 12 rooms running without incident. She began to write. Not a grocery list, not a renovation note, a timeline. She wrote down every trip Grant had taken in the last 3 years. Every dinner, every evening, every weekend where he had been somewhere other than with her. She was an urban planner. She mapped things. She had always mapped things. It was the fundamental skill. Take a complex space. Identify its structure, mark its boundaries, find where the pressure points are, find where the fractures have formed. She mapped her marriage. It took an hour. When she was done, she looked at what she had made. The timeline was annotated. Next to each absence, she had noted what he told her versus what she now understood. Next to the New York conference, hotel keycard from Chicago Waldorf dated same weekend. He was not in New York. Next to the Florence anniversary, Helen's Folder restaurant receipt from Chicago dated Friday of same week. He left early. He did not fly directly. Column by column, row by row, she looked at the annotated timeline of 3 years. The math was not complicated once you laid it out. It was obvious. It was the kind of thing that is invisible when you are inside it, and blindingly clear the moment you step back far enough to see the whole shape. She had not stepped back. She had been so focused on the daily details, the running of the house, the pregnancy, the social obligations, the management of his schedule and his needs, and the invisible infrastructure of his life, that she had not had time to see the whole shape. She had made herself too useful to see clearly. She set the pen down. She looked at what she had written. She thought about something her father had said to her once. When she was 12 and learning to read architectural drawings, "Claire, the building tells you where it's weak. You just have to stop looking at the decoration and look at the structure." She had looked at the decoration. She had been looking at the decoration for 9 years. Her phone buzzed. Her mother's text, "On the train, in at 2. Don't do anything I would have talked you out of before I get there." She smiled. She could not help it. Her mother had been sending versions of that text her entire adult life. She was going to need her mother very much over the next several months. She knew that. She could feel the shape of the next several months from where she sat. They were going to be hard in a way that very few things in her life had been hard. They were going to require everything she had. She pulled the legal pad toward her. She wrote one more thing at the bottom of the timeline. He had access to everything. I had access to nothing that mattered. She looked at that line for a long moment. Then she tore the page out. She folded it neatly. She put it in her purse. Evidence that was also a map. A map of a life she had been living without fully seeing. She was going to see it now. All of it. The kettle had gone cold. She got up to make more tea. She moved around the kitchen with the particular efficiency of a woman who knows exactly where everything is. She had placed everything in this kitchen. She knew where every knife was, where every pot lived, the exact position of every item in every cupboard. This was her kitchen. This was her house. For a few more months at least. Then it would be sorted out by lawyers and divided up and cease to be either of theirs. She was surprised to find that thought more freeing than frightening. Starting over feels impossible, but staying feels worse. She had not let herself think that clearly before. She thought it now. She stood in her kitchen with the kettle in her hand, and she let it land. Staying feels worse. She had known this. She had known this for longer than she had allowed herself to admit. The knowing had lived in her chest like something too large to look at directly. It had been easier to look at the decoration, to manage the surface, to tell herself that every marriage had its difficult seasons and this was one and it would pass. It would not have passed. There was no season coming where this would have resolved itself. There was only the timeline on her legal pad and the hotel keycard in her coat pocket, and the clause on page 7 that he had told her wasn't there. She heard the front door. Grant had left. She had not heard him go. She registered his absence the way you register when a noise you have been habituating to finally stops. The house was quiet. She finished making her tea. She sat back down. She called Warren. "I've been reviewing the financial documents you mentioned," he said. "The transfers into Hargrove Venture Holdings IV are consistent with a pattern I've seen before in cases involving high net worth individuals who anticipate legal proceedings." He was preparing, she said. "It appears so. He may have known for some time that the marriage was heading toward a particular outcome. He was planning the exit while I was planning the nursery," she said. Silence on Warren's end. "Just for a moment, Mrs. Hargrove. I've requested a meeting with his legal team for next week. I think it would benefit us to understand what position they intend to take before we... Has he engaged attorneys yet?" "His regular firm has been in contact with my office this morning." "Yes." She thought about the timeline on the legal pad in her purse. "Good," she said. "Then we know where we stand. There's also the question of press. There's been some interest from a business news blog in the incident." "From Tuesday. The sewer water." "Yes." "What kind of interest?" "A bystander filmed part of it on a phone. The footage exists. It has not been published yet. The blog reached out to Grant's publicist for comment." She closed her eyes. Of course. Of course there was a video. Of course someone had filmed it. This was Chicago. This was a public sidewalk. This was a billionaire's pregnant wife with a pressure hose and a very bad afternoon. "What is Grant's publicist saying?" she asked. "His publicist released a statement this morning that characterizes Tuesday as a difficult moment for the family during a complicated time in the marriage. It describes you as experiencing significant emotional stress due to your pregnancy. She opened her eyes. He's saying I had a breakdown, she said. He is characterizing the incident as emotionally driven rather than, he's saying I was hysterical. He's already writing the story. Yes, Warren said, he is. She sat with that. The cold thing in her chest, the one that had been moving since Tuesday afternoon, settled into something specific and useful. Anger. Not hot, not explosive, cold, precise. The kind of anger that does not need an audience. File whatever we need to file today, she said. And Warren, I want to be very clear about one thing. Yes, he told people I was unstable. He will tell more people I was unstable. He will build a picture of me that serves his narrative. I want it on the record in whatever legal proceeding this becomes that I am not unstable, that I have never been unstable, that this characterization is deliberate and false, and I want it addressed. Understood, Warren said. We can include that in our response to the financial disclosure motion, as context for the court. Good, she said. She ended the call. She set the phone on the island. She sat very still. The baby moved. That long, rolling movement. Something turning over in deep water. She placed her hand on her stomach. She felt the movement under her palm. Real and specific and alive. He had called her unstable. He had told people she was emotionally compromised. He had used her pregnancy, the pregnancy he was present for, while conducting a 3-year affair as the explanation for her behavior. He had held her through a miscarriage with Naomi Reed's name on his phone. He had sat beside her hospital bed and told her it was going to be okay and gone home and texted Naomi Reed that he was managing a situation. She knew this now because Naomi had told her, because Naomi had called her back. She had called Naomi back the previous afternoon after leaving Warren's office. They had spoken for 20 minutes. Naomi's voice on the phone was careful and exhausted in the specific way of someone who had spent 48 hours realizing that the story they had been told was not the story that existed. She said, "He told me about your first pregnancy. He said it was hard. He said you both got through it together. He used the word together. He said the miscarriage brought you closer, but that the closeness didn't last." Claire had been very still on the phone. The miscarriage. The night she was in the hospital. The night he sat beside her and held her hand and said, "We'll try again. We're okay. We'll try again." He had described that to Naomi Reed as a marriage drawing together before falling apart. He had used her grief as evidence for a story he was telling another woman. She had asked Naomi one question. When was the last time you and Grant were together? Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then, last week. He said he was managing things. He said it was almost over. He told me by the end of the year. By the end of the year. He had been planning by the end of the year while she was in the third trimester of a pregnancy he had supported publicly, attended prenatal appointments for, discussed nursery colors for. By the end of the year. She had said, "Naomi, I'd like to meet you. Not to fight. Not to she had stopped. She had started again. I think we both have pieces of a story that neither of us has whole. I'd like to sit in the same room and put them together." Naomi had been quiet for a long time. Then, okay. They had agreed on a time and place. Tomorrow, Wicker Park. A coffee shop that was neither of their usuals. Now sitting at the island in her kitchen, Claire thought about that meeting. She thought about what she was walking toward. She had to choose between her dignity and her security. Both felt impossible to lose. She had thought about this all night. The choice between the life she had built and the self she had traded for it. The choice between the marble countertops and the good schools and the social position and the specific freedom of never having to worry about money and the quieter, harder freedom of not having to perform certainty she did not feel. She did not have an answer yet. She sat with the question. Then she heard a key in the front door. Her mother had said 2 o'clock. It was not yet noon. She got up. She walked to the front hall. Dorothy Whitfield was standing in the doorway with a rolling suitcase and a handled canvas bag that smelled, even from across the hall, of a casserole. She looked at Claire's face. "I took the early train," she said. "Mom, don't tell me you're handling it." She crossed the threshold. She put the canvas bag down. She wrapped both arms around her daughter. She was 5'3" and solid in the way of a woman who had spent decades carrying things. Claire stood there, both arms at her sides. Then she put her arms around her mother. She did not say anything. She did not cry. She just stood there in the front hall of the house she had made beautiful and held on. The coffee shop in Wicker Park was on a corner with large windows that faced the street, bare brick walls, mismatched chairs. The kind of place that had been there since before the neighborhood changed and had survived through a combination of good coffee and absolute consistency. Claire arrived first. She had walked 3 blocks from where she parked. The October air was cold enough now that her breath showed. She walked slowly, not because of the cold, because of the weight she carried in front of her, the pregnancy, and in her chest, the complicated thing that had no clean name. She ordered chamomile tea, sat at a table by the window. She watched the street. She had been thinking since last night about what this meeting was. She had talked to Warren that morning. He had been careful, precise, and honest with her in the way she was learning to rely on. He had said, if Miss Reed is willing to document what she told you on the phone, it becomes a significant piece of evidence. But that decision has to be entirely hers. You cannot put any pressure on it. She had heard that. She understood it. She also understood something he had not said, which was that Naomi Reed was a woman who had been lied to as completely as Claire had, and that there was a thing that happened sometimes between women in this particular configuration, a recognition that the person across the table was not the enemy and had never been. The door opened. Naomi Reed came in. She was different in daylight than she had been in the hotel footage Helen had shown her. Smaller, somehow. She was wearing a gray coat and low heels, and her dark hair was pulled back in a way that made her look younger than 31. She was looking around the coffee shop with the expression of someone who was not entirely sure they should have come. She saw Claire. She walked over. She sat down. She ordered a black coffee without looking at the menu. They looked at each other. "Thank you for coming," Claire said. "I wasn't sure I should," Naomi said. "I wasn't sure either." "But you called me back. You called first," Claire said. "That took something." Naomi looked at the table, then back up. "I need you to know I'm not here to ask you for anything. I'm not here to explain myself or defend anything. She stopped. "I have things that I think you should know, and I think I had things that I needed to say to you directly." "Okay," Claire said. Naomi reached into her bag. She pulled out a small folder. Inside were printed emails. "These are from him," she said. "To me. I printed them because I wanted to have them in a form that wasn't. I didn't want them only on my phone." She set them on the table. "I'm not asking you to do anything with these. I just want you to see them." Claire looked at the folder. She did not reach for it yet. "Before I read them," she said, "tell me something. When did it start?" Naomi was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago. At a conference in New York. "He told me that night that his marriage had been over for 2 years at that point. That you had both agreed to a transition, but that it needed to happen carefully because of financial considerations." "A transition," Claire repeated. "He said you were handling it well. That you were very practical about it. That it was actually, he said it was a relief for both of you." Claire absorbed this. He had told Naomi from the very beginning that the affair was not an affair, that it was something Claire had consented to, that Claire was fine with it, that Claire was practical and modern and understood the situation. He had made the deception about Claire almost invisible by making Claire a participant in the story. "He told me I knew," Claire said. "He told me we had an arrangement." "Yes. Did any part of that seem—" "I should have asked more questions," Naomi said. "I know that. I told myself it wasn't my business to ask, that it was between you and him and that he had told me enough." She looked out the window. "I think I didn't ask more questions because I didn't want to know the answers." This, Claire thought. This was honest. She respected it. "What's in the folder?" she asked. "The emails," Naomi said. "Most of them are routine. Plans, where and when. Ordinary things." She paused. "One of them is not ordinary." She reached into the folder. She removed a single printed page. She set it face up on the table and pushed it toward Claire. It was an email, dated. The date was not one Claire recognized immediately. Then it resolved. The date of her miscarriage. She read the email. "Managing a situation at home. Will see you Friday. Clear your afternoon." Managing a situation. She had been in a hospital. He had been sitting beside her, holding her hand, saying, "We'll try again, we're okay. We'll try again." And he had sent this email. Possibly from the hospital, possibly from the parking lot, certainly from that day. He had called her grief a situation. He had called her loss a thing to manage on the way to seeing someone else. She looked at the email for a long time. The coffee shop continued around her. The sound of the espresso machine. 2 people laughing at a table in the back. The street outside, ordinary and moving. "He was there," she said, "that day. He was there with me." "I know," Naomi said. Her voice was very quiet. "I didn't know that until you told me on the phone. I knew he was managing something. He wasn't specific. He never told me what. He didn't tell you I had a miscarriage. No. Because if you knew, you might have felt guilty. And he needed you not to feel guilty." Naomi looked down at her coffee. "Yes. He managed your conscience," Claire said. "The same way he managed my grief. He managed everything so that everyone around him could function without inconvenient emotions." She sat with that for a moment. "He never loved me. He loved the idea of me." This was the truth she had been circling since Tuesday. The truth she had almost said out loud several times and had stopped just short of, because saying it out loud made it permanent. He had loved the version of her that was useful to him, the version that kept the house beautiful and attended the social events and asked few questions and provided the optics of a stable marriage while he conducted his actual life elsewhere. She had been the background. She had been the setting. She had been the responsible, credible wife who made everything else possible. She had not been the person he loved, because the person he was had never been capable of that kind of love. Not with her. Not with Naomi. Not with anyone. Naomi, she said, I need to ask you something, and you don't have to answer. Naomi looked up. Would you be willing to write down what he told you? About the marriage. About what he said it was. Not for any public purpose. For the legal record. For a court proceeding, potentially. Naomi was very still. You're asking me to testify against him. I'm asking you to document your own experience. What he told you. What you believed based on what he told you. The specific misrepresentations he made. Naomi looked at the window. At the street. At the ordinary world continuing past the glass. He told me you were unstable, she said. He said it in passing, early on. He said you had episodes, that the marriage had survived several of them. He said you were not, he implied you were not reliable. Claire looked at her steadily. He told me that, Naomi said, and I believed him. And then I saw you on Tuesday. And you were, she stopped. You were the most controlled person I have ever seen under the most uncontrolled circumstances imaginable. That is not an unstable woman. No, Claire said. It is not. Naomi picked up her coffee. She drank it. She set it down. I'll write it down, she said. Whatever you need. He lied to me for 3 years. He lied to you for 9. He used both of us as props in a story he was telling himself about what kind of man he was. She looked at Claire. I'm done being his prop. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. She had said this in an elevator. She was saying it now in a different form. In the form of, I know what happened. I know what was real. I know what was false. And I am done allowing the false to substitute for the real. Thank you, Claire said. Don't thank me, Naomi said. I should have. You couldn't have known what you didn't know, Claire said. He designed it that way. Naomi looked at her. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, but the particular settling of a thing that has been held at the wrong angle for too long. What's going to happen to him? Naomi asked. I don't know exactly, Claire said. A lot of lawyers are going to have very long weeks. His firm is going to be complicated. His board is already calling. She paused. He's going to have consequences. Real ones. For maybe the first time. And you? Claire looked at the window, at the street, at the October light coming through the glass, flat and clear. I'm going to figure out who I am without him, she said. It's going to take a while, and it's going to be hard. But I think she stopped. She looked at her hands. Her left hand, with the ring she was still wearing, because taking it off required a decision she had not yet formally made. I think I'm going to be better. She looked at Naomi. I think we both will, she said. The video went public that afternoon. She was back at the Lincoln Park house when Helen called. Dot was in the kitchen reheating the casserole she had brought from Ohio. The house smelled of her mother's cooking for the first time in years, and it was, in its complicated way, a comfort. It's online, Helen said. Business blog. It's not great, Claire. She opened her phone. She found the link. 17 seconds of blurry footage. A cream-colored coat. A maintenance hatch. A sound that was unmistakable even through the compression of a phone camera's audio. The caption, Chicago CEO Grant Hargrove and associate Naomi Reed, caught in apparent incident outside Langham Hotel. Witness accounts describe tense confrontation with a woman identified as Hargrove's wife, Claire Hargrove, who is currently pregnant. Currently pregnant. They had added that detail specifically to make it sympathetic. Not to her. She called Warren. I've seen it, he said. Grant's publicist issued a follow-up statement 20 minutes ago. It describes Tuesday as a deeply concerning moment for the family and states that Grant is committed to ensuring his wife receives the emotional support she needs during this challenging time. Emotional support she needs. He's making me the one who needs help, she said. He is framing it that way. Yes, while the board of directors is calling. 3 members have called for an emergency session, Warren confirmed. The fund vehicles associated with Hargrove Capital are down more than 5% in the past 48 hours. Institutional investors are watching. His publicist is managing multiple stories simultaneously. She thought about that for a moment. Grant managing multiple stories simultaneously. This was what he was good at. This was his particular skill. The construction and maintenance of parallel narratives that never touched each other. He was managing the narrative about the marriage. He was managing the narrative about the firm. He was managing the narrative about Naomi. He was managing the narrative about Claire's mental state. And she was the person who had actually seen his face when he looked at her on that sidewalk. She had seen the calculation. Warren, she said. What happens to the financial disclosure motion if he's also dealing with a board crisis? He becomes overstretched, Warren said, and overstretched people make mistakes. So we wait, we proceed, and we let him manage his multiple problems without helping him consolidate any of them. After the call, she went to the kitchen. She sat at the island. Dot set a bowl of casserole in front of her. She ate it. It was a vegetable and white bean soup her mother had made every winter since she was 6. She ate the whole bowl. She got both mugs out for coffee. The large one for her and the slightly smaller one that she always got for Grant, and then she stopped. She was holding 2 mugs. She stood there at the coffee machine with both mugs in her hands, and the specific absurdity of the situation, which was that her body had made this gesture automatically, out of 9 years of habit, on the day she had met with her husband's mistress and her lawyer and the blog that was suggesting she needed emotional support. She put 1 mug back. She stood at the counter. She drank her coffee. She looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, the oak tree she had fought to keep. She counted it as a victory. Just that. Just the 1 mug. The small act of her body learning something new before her mind had caught up. Dot was washing the pot at the sink. She had her back to Claire. She had been doing this since Claire was small, being in the room without making the room about herself. Being present without demanding acknowledgement of the presence. Mom, Claire said. I deserve better than this. It was the first time she had said it out loud. In those words, as a complete sentence with no qualifiers. Dot turned from the sink. She dried her hands on the dish towel. She looked at her daughter. You did, she said. You do. They stood in the kitchen. The casserole smell. The sound of the October wind against the kitchen window. The oak tree with its remaining rust and gold leaves. What do you need? Dot asked. Not what do you want. Not what should you do. What do you need? I need to get through the next 3 months, Claire said. I need to have this baby. I need to make sure she's okay. And then I need to figure out the rest of it, Dot said. We found out at the 20-week scan. She stopped. I hadn't told many people yet. A girl, Dot said. Yes. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she set down the dish towel. She crossed to the island. She sat on the stool beside Claire. Your grandmother would have loved this, she said. She would have been insufferable about it. She would have started knitting immediately. Claire laughed. She could not help it. It came out of somewhere that had not been reached yet by any of the days preceding. Wait. It lasted 3 seconds, then it stopped. But it had been real. That was the thing. Even here, in this kitchen, on this day, it had been real. She put her coffee cup down. She looked at her hands, her left hand, the ring. She had been wearing it because taking it off required a formal decision. A decision she was not ready to make until she understood what she was deciding. She understood now. She took off the ring. She set it on the island counter. She looked at it. A small plain gold band. She had chosen it herself. Grant had offered a larger diamond, and she had said no. She had said she did not need a large diamond to know what something was. She had been right about that, at least. She left it on the counter. She did not put it away. She just left it there. She would decide later what to do with it. For now it was enough that it was no longer on her hand. Dot looked at the ring. She did not say anything. This was the right call. Not saying anything, just seeing. That evening Helen came over. She brought food she had not cooked but had selected carefully from the grocery store on her way. She sat with Claire and Dot at the kitchen table, and the 3 of them ate and talked about almost nothing for an hour, and it was the most normal hour Claire had had since Tuesday. At some point, Helen's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Something changed in her face. Grant has called 3 people in our social circle, Helen said carefully, to tell them you're not well. He said the sewer water incident was the result of pregnancy hormones and extreme emotional instability. He said he's worried about you. He said he's trying to protect you. Claire looked at the kitchen table. He was moving fast. He was frightened, and he was moving fast, the way a man moves when he knows the structures around him are being examined. He was doing what he did. He was managing the story. He was getting ahead of it. He was using her pregnancy as the explanation for her behavior. He was making her the broken thing so that he could be the concerned thing. Somewhere along the way, I became invisible. She had said this to herself, but now she said it out loud. To Helen. To her mother. I became invisible, she said. I became the thing in the background, the stable surface he operated against. And now he's making sure everyone sees me as the unstable one, because if they see me as unstable, they don't see him at all. Helen and Dot were both looking at her. What are you going to do? Helen asked. Nothing dramatic, she said. I'm going to let Warren file what needs to be filed. I'm going to let the financial disclosure process run. I'm going to let him keep moving, because every time he moves, he creates a record. She paused. And I'm going to have my baby. I'm going to do that first, and I'm going to do it well. And the rest? Dot asked. The rest will come, she said. I just have to make sure I'm still standing when it does. She looked at the ring on the counter. She picked it up. She walked to the small ceramic bowl near the kitchen door, where they kept keys and spare change, and the miscellaneous small objects that accumulate at the edges of a life. She placed the ring in the bowl. She walked back to the table. She sat down. She reached for her glass of water. Now, she said, tell me something that has nothing to do with any of this. Tell me something about your lives. Dot and Helen looked at each other. Then Helen said, my neighbor's cat had kittens. How many? 6. She's calling them after the characters from a show I don't watch. 6 kittens, Claire said. Tell me about the 6 kittens. And for the next 20 minutes, they talked about the 6 kittens. And it was precisely what she needed. And it was precisely what the people who loved her understood how to give her when she needed it. 11 days after the sidewalk, the video had been picked up by 2 aggregators and had accumulated a significant number of views. She knew this because she had made the mistake of checking the view count once at 6 in the morning and had put the phone face down on the nightstand and not checked it again. The board of Hargrove Capital had completed their emergency session. 3 members had resigned citing reputational concerns. The fund vehicles were down more than 7% across 2 weeks. Oliver Cross, the CFO, had issued a public statement of support for Grant that was parsed by 2 financial journalists as notably vague. Grant had called her phone 14 times across 11 days. She had answered 3 times. Each time, he had asked her to meet with him without attorneys, she had said, through Warren. Each time he had been quiet for a moment and then said something she did not engage with, and the call had ended. She was 37 weeks pregnant. She had moved most of her personal items from the Lincoln Park house to the guest room of her mother's extended stay. Dot had rented a serviced apartment 4 blocks away because she would not leave Chicago until after the baby, and she would not stay in the Lincoln Park house because she would not be under the same roof as Grant Hargrove if it could be avoided. Claire went back to the Lincoln Park house every few days to manage things, to oversee the household, to move more of her personal items, to walk through the rooms with the deliberate attention of a woman who is learning the difference between what she has made and what she owns. It was on one of these visits, on a Thursday evening, that she went into the nursery. She had not gone in since the first night. Since the night she sat on the office floor and cried after hearing Naomi's voicemail. She had stood outside the door since then. She had gone past it. She had not gone in. She went in. She turned on the light. The room was exactly as she had left it. The gray-blue walls, the color she had named morning in her head because that was what it looked like. The crib assembled with the sheets she had washed twice. The changing table. The shelves she had painted herself in a slightly lighter gray, with the small books lined up that she had started collecting 6 months ago. And the mobile, hanging from the ceiling above the crib. Half assembled. She had run out of energy to finish it. She had been 31 weeks pregnant and tired and planning to come back to it the next weekend. And then the next weekend there had been something else. And then it had been Tuesday. She stood in the nursery and looked at the half-assembled mobile. The pieces she had not attached were in a small bag on the shelf. All ready. All waiting. She sat down in the glider chair, the one she had bought 6 months ago in a moment of pure hope. She had sat in every glider chair in the store and selected this one. Because the motion was the smoothest and the padding was the firmest, and it was exactly the right height for a woman of her height, and she had been so pleased with herself for selecting it. She sat in the glider. She let it move, back, forward. The smooth, quiet motion. She looked at the room. She looked at the crib. She looked at the half-finished mobile. She looked at all of it. And then, alone in the nursery with the gray-blue walls and the small books lined up on the shelf and the half-finished mobile and the glider moving back and forward in the particular stillness of 11 days after the world ended, she stopped holding on. She let go, she cried. Not the contained, efficient cry of the shower. Not the quiet processing of a woman who is managing herself. She cried the way you cry when the management fails and the structure collapses and there is nothing left to hold the shape with. She cried for the marriage she had believed in. She cried for the 9 years of specific effort and specific hope and specific compromises made in good faith. She cried for the miscarriage. She cried for the hotel key card and the florist receipt, and the photograph from the charity gala and the email about managing a situation. She cried for the woman she had been before she stopped being an urban planner, before she started being Grant Hargrove's wife. Before those 2 things had become so tangled that she could not find where one ended and the other began. She cried for the version of herself that had stood in Florence on their anniversary and thought, he seems distracted, and had not asked, For the version of herself that had sat at the charity gala table counting minutes and had not walked over to the hallway where the photograph was being taken. For all the time she had turned away from a feeling, because turning away was easier than turning toward it, and she had been so tired and there was always so much to manage, and she had convinced herself that the management was love. She cried until she was empty. Then she sat in the glider chair and breathed. In and out, the chair moving, back, forward. The giraffe nightlight was on. She had plugged it in 2 months ago. She had not turned it on. It was on now because she had stepped on the button with her foot when she came in. A small circle of yellow light near the baseboard. The mobile turned slowly. The unfinished part. The piece is still in the bag. She would finish it. She would come back and finish it, but not tonight. Tonight she just sat. The baby was very still. Then she moved. Long and slow. The most deliberate movement she had made in 3 days. Claire put both hands on her stomach. She felt the movement under her palms, real, alive, present. "I know," she said, out loud, to the room, to the baby, to whatever was listening in the gray-blue quiet. "I know we're still here. I know." She fell asleep in the glider, not planned, not comfortable. She woke at 4 in the morning with a stiff neck and both feet slightly numb, and the giraffe nightlight still glowing, and the room smelling of new paint and the specific small silence of a room that has been made ready for someone who has not arrived yet. She sat there for a moment. She was at the bottom. She understood this. She had been working toward this particular darkness for 11 days. She was here now, in it, and she was okay. That was the surprising thing. The bottom was not the end. The bottom was just the bottom. It was hard, and it was cold, and it was lonely in a way that nothing else she had experienced had been lonely. And she was okay. She could feel it. Some part of her, under the grief and the exhaustion and the stiff neck and the numb feet, was intact. Some part of her that had survived everything that came before tonight and would survive tonight too. She got up from the glider. Slowly, both hands on the armrest. She went to the shelf. She picked up the bag with the mobile pieces. She finished the mobile. It took 20 minutes. It was the middle of the night, and she was 37 weeks pregnant, and her neck was stiff, and her feet had pins and needles, and she finished the mobile by the light of the giraffe nightlight. She hung the last piece. She stepped back. She looked at it. The mobile turned slowly in the warmth of the room. The small wooden animals, a giraffe, a rabbit, a small yellow bird turning in slow circles. She had made it. She had started something and left it half finished, and then she had come back to the bottom and found it there waiting, and she had finished it. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. She turned off the giraffe nightlight. She walked out of the nursery. She went to the master bedroom. She lay down. She closed her eyes. She slept for 6 hours. The deepest sleep she had had in 11 days. Patricia Hargrove called on a Monday morning 3 weeks after the sidewalk. Claire was at Dot's rented apartment. She was 39 weeks pregnant and had not slept well in 4 nights and was drinking decaf tea at the kitchen table when her phone buzzed with a number she recognized but had not expected. She looked at it for 3 full rings. Then she answered. Claire. Patricia Hargrove's voice. Precise as a surgical instrument. Every word tested before it was used. "I'd like to meet. Lunch, if you're available, Patricia." She let the silence sit for a moment. "I'll be honest. I'm surprised you're calling." "You should be," Patricia said. "Nevertheless, tomorrow. 1 o'clock, my club." She paused. "You can say no, I'll be there," Claire said. She told Warren about the call that afternoon. He was quiet for a moment. "She's not a neutral party," he said. "I know. If she's calling you directly, without going through her son or his attorneys, she has a reason. She always has a reason. Be careful what you tell her." "Warren," she said, "I have been careful with Patricia Hargrove for 9 years. I know exactly how to handle a careful conversation with that woman." He paused. "Fair," he said. "Also," she added, "my mother is going to insist on waiting in the lobby." "That seems appropriate," Warren said. The club was on the Gold Coast. It had been there since before the neighborhood was called the Gold Coast. White tablecloths. The quiet of a room where the acoustics had been specifically engineered so that no one could hear anyone else's conversation. Patricia Hargrove was already at the table when Claire arrived. She was 71 years old and made no visible concessions to it. White hair cut close. A charcoal suit. Pearls that Claire knew had belonged to her own mother before her. They ordered. They spoke about nothing for exactly 6 minutes. The weather, the November forecast, whether the club's new autumn menu was an improvement on the previous. Claire had done this hundreds of times. She could do it in her sleep. She was the wife of a man who moved in rooms like this. She had learned every version of this particular surface conversation. Then Patricia set down her fork. "I know about the financial restructuring," she said. Claire looked at her. "How?" Because my original investment in Hargrove Capital is protected by a family trust. Any restructuring that touches assets adjacent to that trust requires my awareness. Oliver Cross made an error in the filing paperwork. He categorized certain assets incorrectly, in a way that briefly implicated holdings that are partially mine. He moved some of your assets, Claire said. He moved assets adjacent to mine in a way that was legally complicated and personally unacceptable. Patricia's expression did not change. I have spoken to my own attorneys. The filing has been corrected. Does Grant know you're talking to me? No. They looked at each other across the white tablecloth. The particular geometry of two women who had been operating on the same surface for 9 years and had never once been fully honest with each other. Why are you telling me this? Claire asked. Because I read the prenuptial agreement when it was drafted, Patricia said. I read it because I read everything connected to the Hargrove name. And I thought at the time that the infidelity clause was a very specific choice. It was there to protect him from me, Claire said. Yes. He was always preparing for contingencies. He has been since he was very young. She took a small sip of water. He did not consider that the clause was symmetrical. He forgot which direction it cut. Patricia looked at her. He assumed you would never think to look. He was wrong about that. Yes, Patricia said. He was. She set down her water glass. She smoothed the tablecloth beside her plate. A fastidious, precise gesture that Claire had always recognized as her equivalent of a sigh. I want to be clear about something, Patricia said. I am not here because I disapprove of my son's choices in his marriage. That is between you and him. I am not here to help you against him. Then why are you here? Because he made a financial decision that affects my family's legacy without consulting me. And because the board of Hargrove Capital is conducting an audit, and the audit is going to produce findings that will require the board to make decisions about my son's position. And I would like to understand the full picture before those decisions are made. You want to know how bad it is. I want to know what you know, Patricia said. And I want to offer you something in return. Claire waited. I have documentation of the original asset structure of Hargrove Capital, Patricia said, from my position as a founding investor. Documentation that is relevant to the question of which assets existed before your marriage and which were accumulated during it. This information is relevant to the prenuptial settlement calculation. You would give me that documentation. I would make it available to your attorney, Patricia said, through my own attorney. Without any formal acknowledgement of this conversation, Claire looked at the white tablecloth, at the pearls that had been Patricia's mother's before they were Patricia's, at this woman who had been cool and formal and occasionally intimidating for 9 years, and who was now sitting across from her in a club on the Gold Coast, offering information that would hurt her son, not out of love for Claire, not out of guilt, out of the specific and particular affront of someone who has had their financial legacy touched without permission. Patricia Hargrove was not becoming her ally. Patricia Hargrove was becoming the ally of the structure she was trying to protect. And the structure in this case happened to align with Claire's. That was enough. I'd like to ask you something personal, Claire said. Patricia's expression did not change. Ask it. Did you know? About Naomi Reed, about the affair. Patricia was quiet for 3 seconds. I suspected, she said, for approximately 2 years. Did you tell him to stop? I told him to be careful, Patricia said. About the company. About appearances. She looked at the window. I should have told him to be better. I told him to be careful instead. A pause. That was my failure. I own it. Claire looked at this woman. This precise, controlled, occasionally terrifying woman who had spent her entire life navigating the specific world of men who built things and believed the building entitled them to everything else. She understood Patricia Hargrove better in this moment than she had in 9 years. Have Warren contact your attorney, Claire said. And thank you for coming. Don't thank me, Patricia said. She picked up her fork again. Her posture was exactly as it had been at the start of lunch, entirely composed. Finish your meal. You need to eat. Claire looked at her plate. She picked up her own fork. They ate lunch. They continued to talk about nothing. The November weather. The club's new menu. Whether it was an improvement. She did not cry until she was in the back of the car going home. Not out of sadness. Out of the complicated, relieved recognition that sometimes the world showed you something unexpected and honest when you had stopped expecting either. She sat in the car and cried for 3 minutes. Then she stopped. She wiped her eyes. She called Warren. I need to tell you about lunch, she said. She woke at 3:47 on a Thursday morning with the specific quality of pain that her obstetrician, Dr. Ruth Caldwell, had described at every appointment for the past 3 months. You will know when you know. You won't spend 10 minutes wondering if this is it. You will know. She knew. She lay still for 30 seconds. Timing. Then she got up. She went to the bathroom. She dressed. She picked up the bag that had been packed for 2 weeks and sitting by the bedroom door, she went to the kitchen. She made herself one piece of toast and ate it standing up at the counter. Her mother had read somewhere in one of the 12 pregnancy books she had purchased upon arriving in Chicago that it was important to eat something if labor started at home. She ate the toast. She looked out the kitchen window at the November darkness. The street was empty. The sky had not yet decided what it was going to do today. She called her mother. Dot answered on the second ring. Coming, she said, before Claire had spoken. 5 minutes, she called Helen. Helen said, I'm already putting on shoes. She sat down at the kitchen table. She put her hands on the table. She breathed. She did not call Grant. She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully, and she had not arrived at a clean answer, and she had finally decided to let the first part of the day be just her and the people who had been there when she needed them. There would be time for the rest later, after. Dot arrived at 4:03. Helen at 4:11. The hospital was 12 minutes away. Dr. Caldwell was already there when they arrived. She had the specific calm of someone who had been doing this for 22 years and had seen every version of every possible situation and found all of them manageable. Labor was long. It was hard. It was not the way the books described it, and it was exactly the way Dr. Caldwell had described it. She held her mother's hand on one side and Helen's hand on the other, and she breathed, and she did not perform anything for anyone. At 11:42 in the morning, 7 pounds and 1 ounce of a girl came into the world with a sound that was not quite a cry, an announcement, a declaration of presence. The room was very still for one moment. Then Claire laughed. It came from somewhere below the exhaustion and above the pain, and it was entirely real. 3 seconds of genuine, helpless, overwhelming laughter. Hello, she said. To the room. To the person who had been moving inside her for months. To her daughter, who was being placed on her chest, and who had dark hair and her grandmother's nose. Hello. There you are. Dot was crying. She was not making any effort not to be crying. She had stopped making efforts of that kind 20 years ago and was much happier for it. Helen was looking at the ceiling with her jaw very tight, which was what she did instead of crying, which she maintained she did not do. Claire held her daughter. She looked at her. She had known her already, in the way you know someone you have been carrying. She had known the pattern of her movements and the particular rhythm of her sleep and the way she responded to music and to voices and to the sound of rain on windows. She had known all of that. And still, this was different. This was the person herself. Margaret, Claire said. I'm going to call you Maggie until you tell me you prefer Margaret. I think you'll prefer Margaret by the time you're 8. Maggie looked at her. The specific, unfocused gaze of a new person encountering a new world. She's here, Claire said, to no one in particular. To everyone. She's actually here. She called Grant at 1:15 in the afternoon. When he picked up, she said, she's born. 7 pounds, 1 ounce, both healthy. You can come to the hospital if you'd like to. He was there by 2 o'clock. He came with flowers, pale pink roses, and the expression of a man who had prepared carefully for this interaction and was not entirely sure his preparation was sufficient. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at Maggie in the clear-sided bassinet. Something crossed his face. Claire watched it. She was watching for the performance. She was watching for the calculation, the assessment. She did not see those things. What she saw was something real, something that broke through the managed surface and was, for a moment, entirely unmanaged. He looked at his daughter and he felt something he had not arranged. She believed it was love, not because it redeemed anything, not because it changed what had happened, but because it was real and she was done. She was completely and irrevocably done living in the space between real things and their performance. She's beautiful, he said. She is, Claire said. He looked at her. Thank you for calling me. She's your daughter, she said. She's going to need you. I'm going to need her to have the best version of you that you can manage. Claire, we'll talk about the rest through Warren. You know that. I know. He looked at Maggie. What's her name? Margaret, she said. Maggie. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his daughter. He was a father who was going to have to learn how to be a father outside the structure of a marriage he had destroyed. That was going to be its own complicated journey. That journey was not her to manage. Thank you for the flowers, she said. You can stay for a little while. Visiting hours end at 6. He stayed for 45 minutes. He held Maggie for 3 of them, with the careful uncertainty of someone who is not entirely sure what they are doing and is trying very hard anyway. Then he left. He stopped in the doorway. He did not say anything. He just stopped. Then he left. Her mother came back in. Helen came back in. They sat on either side of her and they were together, the 4 of them, the 3 women and Maggie, in the white room with the pale pink roses in the November afternoon going gray outside the window. At 2 in the morning, Maggie woke. Claire fed her. She walked her. She sang something quietly that was not quite a song, just a rhythm, just the sound of a voice that her daughter had been hearing for months from the inside. Maggie settled. Claire put her in the bassinet. She stood there for a moment looking down at her. I am someone's mother, she thought. I have been someone's mother for 14 hours and 33 minutes. I am already the most important person to someone who exists entirely independently of him. He did not give me this. This is mine. She went back to bed. She lay in the white room with the hospital sounds distant and the November dark outside the window and Maggie's small breathing in the near silence. She did not sleep right away. She lay there and thought about the word beginning. Not a new life starting over. Not a life that had been broken and had to be reassembled. Something different from both of those. A beginning that rose from the middle of something else. A beginning that contained everything that came before it and used it not despite it, but because of it. She had learned to read fine print the hard way. She had learned what the calculation before the guilt looked like. She had learned the difference between a house you inhabit and a home you build. She had learned what it felt like to be the background. She was done being the background. She was going to be the whole picture. I thought love meant sacrifice. Not erasure, she thought. You are going to know the difference. She said it quietly. To Maggie, who was asleep and could not hear her, and to herself, who could. Then she closed her eyes. She slept. 6 weeks after Maggie was born, the world had continued to happen while she was not looking. Hargrove Capital's board had completed the first stage of their independent audit. The results were not public, but their effects were visible. Grant had been moved to an advisory role pending the second stage. Oliver Cross had retained his own attorney, which was noted in a brief item in a financial trade publication. Warren called on a Tuesday morning. Claire was sitting at Dot's kitchen table. Maggie was in the bouncy seat beside her, doing the serious work of examining her own hands. The financial disclosure process has produced significant results, Warren said. Hargrove Venture Holdings IV, the secondary limited liability company, has been flagged for a temporary restraining order. The $14 million in transfers are being reviewed as potential marital asset dissipation, meaning he moved money he wasn't supposed to move, meaning the timing and nature of the transfers relative to your ongoing marriage and the legal proceedings raise serious questions about their legitimacy.
Yes. And Oliver Cross?
His attorney contacted my office last week. He is cooperating fully, providing a complete account of the transfer process and Grant's instructions to him. She looked at Maggie, who had moved on from examining her hands to examining the ceiling with equal seriousness. What does the prenuptial infidelity clause mean now? She asked. With all of this documentation, Warren paused. With Ms. Reed's documented statement, with Mr. Cross's cooperation, with the evidence your friend Helen provided, with the hotel records and the financial timeline, the clause is activated. What does that mean in numbers, conservatively? $40 to $50 million in a structured settlement. Potentially more, depending on how the asset transfers are categorized by the court. The kitchen was quiet. Maggie made a small sound. The particular sound of a person who has discovered something interesting about ceiling light fixtures. Warren, Claire said, I want to say something to you. Of course. That number. That's not what this is about. I know that. I didn't go looking for the prenuptial clause because I wanted $50 million. I didn't start any of this because of money. Mrs. Hargrove, I have been doing this for 25 years. I know the difference between someone who is motivated by money and someone who is motivated by recognition. He paused. You want to be recognized for what you contributed, for what you gave to that marriage, for what it cost you. Yes, she said. That is what the law is designed to do, he said, when it works correctly. It is designed to see the contribution that is invisible and put a number on it, not because the number is the point, but because it is the language the system speaks. She looked at Maggie. Maggie had found the ceiling fan and was working out its geometry. File whatever needs to be filed, she said. And tell me what I need to do. Continue what you're doing, he said. And perhaps review the financial documents you have legitimate access to. The quarterly reports you received as a corporate spouse. The publicly available filings. There may be things in those documents that are useful. Things that a person with your particular eye for structure would find. My urban planner's eye, she said. Yes, he said. Exactly that. After the call, she went to the spare bedroom in Dot's apartment, the room that had become her makeshift office in the past 6 weeks. She had stacked the relevant documents, the quarterly reports, the filings, the financials she had access to in a pile that had been growing for 2 weeks. She sat down at the small desk. She opened the first document. She had been a good urban planner. Not just competent. Good. She had the particular skill for reading the structure beneath the surface, for understanding how a system was built and where the stress points were and which elements were load-bearing and which were decorative. She had stopped using that skill when she stopped being an urban planner. She had used it incompletely, unconsciously in running Grant's household and managing his social obligations and reading his board presentations before he gave them. She had used it without naming it, without understanding that she was using a professional skill in a personal context. She was naming it now. She read the documents. She made notes. She cross-referenced. She marked things with a red pen and wrote questions in the margin and drew lines between structures that were not immediately obviously related. She found the stress points. She found the places where the financial structure of Hargrove Capital had been designed to obscure rather than clarify. The nested limited liability companies, the fund vehicles within fund vehicles, the way certain assets had been moved between entities at quarterly intervals in a pattern that was consistent with a strategy she recognized from her reading, a strategy for reducing visible marital assets over time. It had been happening for at least 18 months. Not just the 6-week Hargrove Venture Holdings transaction. 18 months. He had been planning for 18 months. She sat back. She looked at what she had drawn on the legal pad. A map. A map of a financial structure and its failure points. She photographed every page. She sent it to Warren. Found something, she wrote. Call me when you can. Warren called within 20 minutes. He listened to her explanation. He was quiet for a long moment. You mapped this yourself, he said. I'm an urban planner, she said. Or I was. It's the same skill set, Mrs. Hargrove, Warren said. And there was something different in his voice. Not warmer, exactly, but more present. This is very useful. I know, she said. I used to be good at my job. You still are, he said. You just had a different job for a while. She set the phone down. She looked at the map she had made. She had forgotten this about herself, this specific thing. The way her mind worked when it was applied to something real. The specific satisfaction of finding the hidden structure, of making the invisible visible. She had forgotten it because she had put it aside. She had put herself aside to become something else, and she had done it so completely that she had almost persuaded herself that what remained was all there was. But it had been here, all of it, waiting. The way a thing waits when it knows it will be needed again. She picked up her pen. She went back to the documents. She kept reading. Maggie from the other room made a sound of intense concentration. I know, Claire called. I know. I'm working. That evening, she finished the nursery. She had moved what she needed from the Lincoln Park house. The nursery items were at the rented apartment now, the crib, the glider, the mobile. She had reassembled everything in the small second bedroom. She had put the mobile up first. She stood back and looked at the room. It was smaller than the Lincoln Park nursery. The walls were white because she had not had time to paint them, and she had realized, standing in the room, that she liked the white. It was clean. It was ready for whatever she chose to do with it. The mobile turned slowly. The 3 small wooden animals. The giraffe. The rabbit, the yellow bird. She had made that. At 4 in the morning in the worst night of the past 2 months. She had been at the bottom and she had gotten up and finished something. She thought about that. About the specific relationship between finishing something when you are at the bottom and being able to stand up from the bottom. The act of completion as a form of evidence. Evidence that you are still capable, still present, still yourself. She thought about what it was going to look like. The next year. The apartment she would find, the work she would go back to, the morning routines with Maggie, the evenings. The new calendar, structured by her own choices, not by someone else's schedule. She thought about the urban planning notebooks. She had them. They were in a box in the rented apartment. She had not opened them. Not yet. But she knew they were there. She thought soon. She reached up and gave the mobile a small push. The 3 animals turned in slow circles. The giraffe, the rabbit, the yellow bird. She watched him turn. His money was never mine, she thought. And that is okay. But what I helped build, what I gave to that marriage, that was mine. That was real. I want it recognized. She was going to make sure it was recognized. Patricia Hargrove's statement was released on a Wednesday morning in December. Claire read it on her phone while Maggie was napping. 3 sentences. Issued in Patricia's name as founding investor and named trustee of the Hargrove Family Trust. I have long supported Hargrove Capital as a founding investor and remain committed to its sound management. In light of recent developments regarding asset management practices, I am calling for an independent financial review of all transactions made in the past 24 months. I am committed to the integrity of the Hargrove name and the legacy it represents. 3 sentences. Each one precise, each one positioned exactly where it needed to be. She had not mentioned Grant by name. She had not needed to. The statement landed like a stone in still water. The ring spread outward immediately. 2 institutional investors called for their own audit access. 3 board members who had been waiting to see which direction Patricia would move now moved. Grant's remaining legal team called Warren within the hour. They want a settlement conversation, Warren said. Do they? They have asked for an informal meeting, without court involvement, to discuss terms. She thought about this for a moment. She thought about what a settlement conversation meant, what it would require her to sit in the same room with, what she would have to see across a table. Set it up, she said. But Warren, I want the non-disparagement clause. That is non-negotiable. Explain what you mean. He told people I was unstable. He told his social circle. He told Naomi Reed. He used that characterization deliberately to undermine me. I want a formal acknowledgement, signed that the characterization was false. Not just a mutual non-disparagement agreement, a specific documented acknowledgement. Warren was quiet for a moment. That's an unusual ask. He may resist it. Yes, she said. He may. What happens if he resists? Then we go to court, she said. And the financial disclosure findings become public record. Warren paused. I'll present it, he said. She set the phone down. She picked it up again almost immediately. She called her father. James Whitfield answered on the third ring. His voice was the same as it had been for 69 years, low and unhurried and completely itself. Claire, he said. Hi, Dad. How's the baby? Good. Growing. She smiles at me now. Real smiles. Not gas. Good, he said. A pause. In her father's conversational style, a pause was not empty. It was what he was thinking. I wanted to call, she said. Just a call. I know, he said. I'm okay, she said. For real. Not the way I say it when I'm not. Another pause. She could hear him breathing on the other end. She could hear the background sounds of the house she grew up in. The specific creak of the back screen door. I know, he said again. And then after a long pause, your mother says you've been reading a lot of financial documents. I have. She says you found something important in them. I did. Good, he said. A single word. The fullest word he owned. They talked for 20 minutes. About nothing. About the weather in Ohio, which was significantly worse than Chicago. About his neighbor's fence project, which had been ongoing for 3 years. About whether Maggie looked like the Whitfield side of things. She has your mother's ears, he said. She has Dot's ears, Claire said. You're right. I hadn't noticed. Your mother doesn't know that, he said. Don't tell her. I won't, she said. When she hung up, she sat with the phone in her lap and felt for the first time in weeks that she was inside her own life. Not looking at it from the side, not managing it from a slight remove. Inside it, present in it. The feeling was familiar. She had felt it before a long time ago, before she had learned the habit of standing at the edge of her own experiences to make sure they were being presented correctly. She was done presenting. She was going to be in the room from now on. The next morning, she called Grant directly. He answered immediately. He was expecting the call, or a version of it. I want to meet, she said. Before the formal mediation, just us, no attorneys, at the house, 30 minutes, silence. All right, he said. Thursday, 2 o'clock. Yes, he said. Thursday, she hung up. She went to tell Dot, who was in the kitchen with Maggie. You're meeting with him, Dot said. Not a question. Yes. Do you want me to be there? No, but I want you in the building. Dot considered this. I can take Maggie for a walk around the block. For 30 minutes. For 30 minutes, Dot said. And if you're not out of that house in 31 minutes, I'm coming in with the casserole pot. The casserole pot, Claire said. It's heavy, Dot said. Thursday. 2 o'clock, the Lincoln Park house. She arrived 5 minutes before him. She let herself in with her key. She went to the living room. She sat in one of the chairs by the window, not the sofa, not the side where she usually sat. One of the formal chairs that faced the room. She waited. He came in at exactly 2 o'clock. He looked tired. Not depleted. Grant Hargrove was not a man who depleted easily. But the managed, composed surface that had always been his primary presentation was showing something underneath it. Something that had been compressed for a long time and was becoming harder to keep compressed. He sat on the sofa across from her. He set his phone face down on the cushion beside him. He looked at her. You wanted to talk, he said. I do, she said. One conversation. I want to understand one thing before this goes to formal mediation. All right? Are you going to fight me on custody? He looked at her for a long moment. Then no joint legal, primary residence with me. Generous visitation with full schedule transparency. Yes, he said, I'll agree to those terms. I want that in writing before mediation. As a starting point, not a negotiated position. Yes, he said. She nodded. She looked at him. She was looking at the face she had loved for 9 years. The face she had believed she knew better than she knew anything. The face she now understood she had known partly. The managed part. The presented part. The part he chose to show her. She was not angry. She had been angry, the clean, cold anger that she had used as clarity, but it was not anger she felt now. She felt something closer to sorrow. Not for herself, for what could have been and was not, for the specific waste of it, for the years and effort and genuine love she had given to something that was being conducted simultaneously in a different room she did not know about. The waste. Grant, she said. Yes. I want you to be a good father to her. I want that too. I'm going to make sure she knows you. I'm going to make sure she has the relationship with you that she deserves. That's not contingent on how any of this resolves. It's what she deserves. He looked at his hands. He was quiet for a moment. Then thank you. Don't thank me, she said. Just be the person she needs. She stood up, she straightened her coat. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She stopped. She did not turn around. Warren will send the custody terms for your attorney to review by end of week, she said. And I need the acknowledgement about my mental state. In writing, signed by you, Claire. Signed by you, Grant. Not your attorney. You. She walked out the door. She stood on the front step. The December air was cold and clean. The street was quiet in the way that residential Chicago streets are quiet in the middle of a weekday afternoon. Her mother came around the corner with Maggie in the stroller. Dot looked at her face. Then she looked at the house. Then back at Claire. Well? Dot said. It's done, Claire said. Or the beginning of done. Maggie was awake in the stroller. She was wearing the small red hat with the pompon that Helen had bought for her, and looking at the December sky with the expression she was developing for things she found interesting. Hello? Claire said to her. She crouched down beside the stroller, coat and all. She was eye level with her daughter. Hello, Maggie. Maggie turned to look at her. The smile came immediately. That specific, direct smile, the one that said, you, I know you. You're mine. Claire felt it in her chest. That smile, it lived there now. It had moved in and it was not leaving. I stayed quiet for years, she said quietly, to herself, to the December street, to no one. I am done being quiet. January. The city was cold in the flat, determined way that Chicago cold is determined. The kind of cold that does not apologize. The lake was mostly frozen at the edges. The streets were clear, but the air was the kind of air that says this is what this is. Get dressed accordingly. Claire was dressed accordingly. A dark blue wool coat she had bought herself specifically for this. Not the cream one. She had decided at some point in December that she could not precisely identify that she was done with the cream coat. It had been beautiful. She had loved it. But it had been on her the afternoon of the sidewalk, and it had become the coat she associated with carrying someone else's dry cleaning. The dark blue was hers. She had bought it for this. She walked into Warren's building at 9:45 in the morning. Maggie was in the infant carrier against her chest, because Dot had had a cold for 3 days and she would not leave Maggie with anyone else today. Not today of all days. She carried her daughter into the building where her marriage was going to be formally ended. This, she thought, was the correct way to do it. The elevator opened. She walked to Warren's conference room door. She could hear voices inside. She could not hear the words. She stopped. She put one hand on Maggie's back. She felt the small, steady rise and fall. She took one breath. Deliberate. Full, okay, she said, quiet to herself. To Maggie, who was asleep. To the door. Okay. She opened the door. Grant was there with 2 attorneys, Francis Holt and a younger man whose name she did not know. Oliver Cross was not present. He was in his own separate legal process. Patricia's personal attorney was there, representing the Hargrove Family Trust's position as a separate interested party. And Warren, beside Claire's chair, with a glass of water already placed. She sat down. She unclipped the carrier slightly so Maggie could breathe more freely. She settled. Warren set a folder in front of her. She looked at it. She did not open it. She looked at Grant. He looked back. 9 years of knowing each other's face across tables. He knew what she looked like when she was frightened and what she looked like when she was certain. She watched him read her face. She watched him understand that the woman across from him now was not the woman who had been standing on the sidewalk carrying his dry cleaning. Warren began to speak. He spoke for 45 minutes. He presented the documentation systematically, methodically, with the patient precision of a man who had done this many times and understood that the method itself was part of the argument. He presented the prenuptial clause. He presented the documentation of infidelity, Helen's folder, Naomi's statement, the hotel records, the financial timeline. He presented the Hargrove Venture Holdings transfers and the legal analysis of them as potential marital asset dissipation. He presented the findings from Oliver Cross's cooperation. He presented Patricia's documentation of the original Hargrove capital asset structure. He presented the map Claire had made of the nested financial entities and the pattern of transfers across 18 months. He set it on the table. He said, "This analysis was conducted by Mrs. Hargrove. She is a licensed urban planner with particular expertise in structural analysis. She identified this pattern independently." Grant's lead attorney, Frances, looked at the map. She looked at Grant. Grant was looking at Claire. Frances leaned over and said something quietly in his ear. He did not look away from Claire. "Mr. Hargrove's position," Frances said, turning to address Warren, "is that while certain of these findings may be subject to interpretation, they are not subject to interpretation," Warren said. "They are documented." A pause. The conference room was very quiet. Maggie shifted slightly in the carrier, made a small sound, settled. "Mr. Hargrove is prepared," Frances said after a long moment, "to accept the structured settlement as outlined, including the asset division as proposed." Warren looked at Claire. She nodded once. "There is one additional item," Warren said. He set a single page on the table. He slid it across to Frances. She read it. She passed it to Grant. He read it. "The acknowledgement of the deliberate mischaracterization of Claire's mental state. Not a mutual non-disparagement agreement. Specific, documented, signed acknowledgement." Frances said, "This isn't unusual. It's non-negotiable," Warren said. Mrs. Hargrove made that clear at the outset. "The clause is in the document. It requires Mr. Hargrove's personal signature." Grant set the page down on the table. He looked at it for a long moment. He picked up the pen. He signed it. The page slid back across the table to Warren, to Claire. She looked at it, his signature. On a document that said clearly and for the record that he had deliberately misrepresented her mental state and that the representation was false. He had called her unstable in a document that was now in the legal record of their marriage. He had signed a document admitting he was wrong. It was not dramatic. It was a piece of paper, a signature on a piece of paper. It was also the only apology she was going to receive. Not in words, not in person. In the language of legal documentation. That was enough. She had stopped waiting for the other kind. "We can schedule the formal court date to finalize," Frances began. "Yes," Warren said. "I'll have my office contact you." The meeting ended. People gathered papers. People spoke in the professional shorthand of attorneys concluding a session. It took 8 minutes. Grant left the conference room without looking at her again. Frances stopped at the door. She looked at Claire. Something passed across her expression. Not warmth, more like the acknowledgement of a fellow professional. She nodded, once. She left. Claire sat for a moment after the room emptied. Just her and Warren and Maggie, who was waking up now, looking around with the expression she had for unfamiliar faces. "Well," Warren said. "Well," Claire said. "The formal settlement will take several weeks to finalize." "The court date, I know," she said. "Warren." She looked at him. "Thank you. For all of it." He looked slightly uncomfortable in the way of a man who does not know what to do with gratitude. "I did my job." "You did it very well," she said. He picked up his folder. He paused. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Hargrove, in 25 years, I have not had a client who found the 18-month asset transfer pattern on their own." "It's a structural problem," she said. "I read structural problems." "Yes," he said, "you do." He went to the door. He stopped. "What are you going to do now?" She looked at Maggie. Maggie was looking at the ceiling of the conference room with complete absorption. "I'm going to go look at the lake," she said. "And then I'm going to open some notebooks I haven't opened in a long time." She walked to the elevator. She went down. She walked out of the building into the January cold. She went to the parking garage. She strapped Maggie into the car seat with careful, practiced hands. She got in, she started the car. She drove to the lakeshore. She parked. She turned the engine off. She sat. The lake was enormous and gray and edged with ice and completely indifferent to the fact that she had just watched the formal conclusion of her marriage be agreed to in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on North Michigan Avenue. She looked at it for a long time. Maggie made a sound from the back seat, a sound of inquiry. "Hi," Claire said to the lake, to her daughter, to the January sky above the frozen edges of an enormous body of water. "Hi. I do not need to be saved," she thought. "I need to save myself." She already had. Naomi Reed filed the complaint on a Thursday morning in January. She filed it with the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. She filed it herself, without an attorney, because she had decided that this particular act needed to be entirely hers. The complaint was specific. It documented her professional involvement in certain Hargrove Capital transactions during the period of the affair. It documented that she had at the time been in possession of information about the fund structures that she had not reported because she had not understood the extent of the impropriety and because she had been operating inside a personal situation that compromised her professional judgment. She was not filing to hurt Grant specifically. She was filing because she was a professional who had been compromised and she was making it right. That was the word she kept returning to. Right. She was making it right in the only specific way available to her. The way that was entirely within her own professional jurisdiction. She walked out of the regulatory office at 10:15 in the morning. The January air was very cold. She bought a cup of coffee from the cart on the corner. She stood on the sidewalk and drank it. She was 31 years old. She had a professional reputation to rebuild. A career she had paused and would need to restart. A story she would have to tell about herself, not to other people, not yet, but to herself first. The story of a woman who had been deceived and who had also chosen not to look too hard at things she might have seen. The two things were both true. She was holding both of them. She was 31 years old, and she was holding two complicated truths simultaneously and standing on a sidewalk in January with a cup of coffee, and it was, in its complicated way, a beginning. She had called Claire the week before to let her know what she was planning. Claire had listened without saying much. At the end, she had said, "That's yours to do, not mine." "I know," Naomi had said. "I just wanted you to know." "I appreciate that," Claire had said. Then after a pause, "Naomi, you didn't ruin my marriage." "He did. Both things are true, and the second one matters more." Naomi had been quiet for a moment. "I should have asked more questions," she had said. "Maybe," Claire had said. "But he was very good at making sure the questions didn't feel necessary. That's what he does. He creates a world where the questions don't occur to you, and then when they do occur to you, he makes sure your confidence in them is low enough that you set them aside." "He told me you were fragile," Naomi said. "I know. You are the least fragile person I've ever met." A pause. "No," Claire had said. "I was fragile. I was very fragile for a long time. Inside something that was designed to make fragility look like stability. I'm not fragile anymore. Those are different things." Now, standing on the sidewalk outside the regulatory office, Naomi thought about that conversation, about the distinction between being fragile and being made to feel fragile, about the difference between what you are and what you are told you are often enough that you begin to believe it. She drank her coffee. She watched a bus go past. She watched two people argue companionably over a phone screen. She watched an old man walk a very small dog with enormous seriousness. She did not know what came next. She had a sublet on a Lakeview apartment. She had savings. She had a professional record that, prior to the complicating circumstances of the past 3 years, had been strong. She had the specific, uncomfortable, possibly useful feeling of not knowing. She could live with not knowing. She threw away the coffee cup. She started walking. She did not have a destination. She walked anyway, 1 block, 2, 3. The cold air and the January sky, and the particular quality of a city that is continuing regardless. She was continuing regardless. That was enough. February. 5 months after the sidewalk. The winter light in Chicago in February has a specific quality. Low, almost horizontal. It comes in at an angle that makes everything look like a black and white photograph before noon. Then the noon light hits and everything becomes very clear, very precise. Every edge defined. Claire liked it. She had always liked Chicago winter light. She had forgotten that too, somewhere in the last few years. She was remembering it now. She had found an apartment in Bucktown. Second floor. 2 bedrooms. A kitchen with a window that faced east and got the morning light. A living room with enough space for 2 chairs and a rug she had liked. A second bedroom for Maggie, which she had painted a pale yellow because she was done with gray for the time being. She had moved in the first week of February. The Lincoln Park house was in the process of being sold. She had taken from it what was hers and left up what was not, and had spent 3 hours one afternoon going through room by room with a specific, deliberate attention. The furniture she had chosen, the art she had sourced, the kitchen she had designed. She had looked at all of it and made a list, and the list was divided into mine and his and neither. The neither pile was surprisingly large. She was not sentimental about it. She had been sentimental once about every object in that house. She had known the story of every room. She had curated it. She had loved it. She did not love it anymore, or rather she loved the person who had made it, and that person was her, and she was taking herself with her. The apartment in Bucktown smelled like fresh paint, and the specific clean smell of a new space that has not yet accumulated a history. She liked that too. The blankness, the possibility of it. She put the rug down first, the one she had liked. It was deep green and slightly worn, and she had found it at an estate sale 3 years ago and had never found the right room for it in the Lincoln Park house. It was right in this room. It had been waiting for this room. She put Maggie's mobile in the second bedroom. She assembled the crib. She made the bed with the sheets she had washed herself. She hung the mobile. She put 2 chairs in the living room. Secondhand. She had found them on a resale website and gone to pick them up in her own car and carried them up the stairs herself, one at a time at 8 weeks postpartum. while Dot supervised from the bottom of the staircase with an expression of profound anxiety. She put a small side table between them, a lamp she had bought new because she had earned the right to one new lamp. She put her boxes in the second bedroom. She unpacked clothes. She unpacked Maggie's things. She unpacked her kitchen equipment, the good knives, the Dutch oven, the coffee things. And then, at the bottom of one box, she found the notebooks, her urban planning notebooks, from before. From the years when she had been Claire Whitfield, who was going to design neighborhoods that made sense for the people who lived in them. She had not opened these in 5 years. She had put them in a box somewhere around year 4 of the marriage, when the last project she had worked on was finally wrapped up and she had not found the next one, and then the marriage and the household had simply filled the space so completely that there was no room for the next one. She carried the notebooks to the kitchen table. She sat down. She set them in front of her. Maggie was in the bouncy seat beside her, very serious about a plastic giraffe toy that made a sound when she squeezed it. Claire opened the top notebook. Her own handwriting. Notes from a project she had worked on 7 years ago, a residential development in the near west side. Analysis of transit access. Population density considerations. The specific questions she had been trained to ask. Who lives here? What do they need? What does the space currently say to them, and what do they need it to say? She read through 10 pages. Then she stopped. She set the notebook down. She got up. She made coffee. She made 1 cup. She got 1 mug out of the cabinet without thinking, without looking, without any particular awareness of it as an act. She brought the coffee back to the table. She sat down. She opened the notebook again. This was who she was before she became someone else's background. This was what she did. This was the specific language her mind spoke when it was doing what it was actually built for. She had put this away. She had convinced herself there wasn't room for it, that she would come back to it, that there would be time. The time was now. She picked up a pen. She turned to a blank page at the back of the notebook. She started writing. Not notes from a past project. Notes for a new one. She had received a call 2 weeks ago from a nonprofit organization that worked on affordable housing development on Chicago's South Side. They needed a consultant to help them navigate a city permit process. A small project, part-time, 3 months. She had said yes. She was writing her preliminary notes now. The questions she would bring to the first meeting. The systems she would need to understand. The structural analysis that would need to happen before she could map the path forward. She wrote for 40 minutes. Maggie fell asleep in the bouncy seat. The apartment was quiet in the way that new apartments are quiet. A quiet that has not yet been inhabited enough to have personality. She was going to give it personality. It was going to take time, and she was fine with that. She looked up from the notebook. She looked around the kitchen, the east window. The morning light, horizontal white. She had spent 9 years making someone else's life beautiful. She was going to spend the next ones making her own. Not beautifully in the decorative sense, in the structural sense, in the sense of well-made, load-bearing, built for the actual people who lived in it. She looked at her 1 cup of coffee, still warm. She thought about the morning she had gotten 2 mugs out of the cabinet. She thought about putting one back. She did not remember doing it this morning. She had just gotten one. No effort, no grief. No deliberate act of reprogramming, just one. Because that was the right number for this morning in this kitchen. That was the thing that surprised her. Not the dramatic moments, not the confrontations or the legal victories or the signed acknowledgement in the conference room. The 1 mug, the way the body learned, the way the habits of a life reorganized themselves quietly, without announcement, while you were busy doing other things. She was busy doing other things. She was busy being herself. That was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. This is the beginning, she thought. Not the end, not a declaration, not a triumph. Just the simple, clean recognition of what this was, of where she stood in the story, the beginning, of something she had not yet seen the shape of something she was going to build with the specific skills she had always had and had set aside and had found again at the bottom of a box in a February apartment. She picked up her pen. She went back to the notebook. She kept writing. She took a walk that afternoon. She pushed Maggie in the stroller for 45 minutes without a destination. Just Bucktown, the streets she did not yet know, the coffee shop she had not yet tried, the building facades that she was already assessing with a professional eye even when she was not trying to. The neighborhood had its own structure, its own history of who had lived here and what they needed and what the space had become in response. She was reading it the way she read everything, the way she had always read things before she stopped. She turned a corner and found a small park. Bare trees, a bench, a view through the branches to a slice of gray February sky. She sat on the bench. She turned the stroller so Maggie faced her. Maggie was awake now, alert, looking at the trees with the expression she had for things that moved. Good, right? Claire said. The trees. Maggie made a sound. Agreement, possibly. Or a completely unrelated observation about the quality of the light. She sat on the bench in the park in February with her 4-month-old daughter looking at bare trees, and she thought about what was ahead of her. The South Side Housing Project. It was going to be good work. She already knew it. She had read the documents the nonprofit had sent, and she had felt, reading them, the specific activation of something that had been dormant. The apartment with the green rug and the 2 second-hand chairs in the east window. Maggie, who would learn to sit up, to crawl, to stand, to walk, to talk, to read, to have opinions. To be, eventually, whoever Margaret Hargrove chose to be, and Claire was going to be there for all of it. These things ahead of her. And behind her, a legal pad with a 9-year timeline. A hotel keycard, a prenuptial clause. A man across a mediation table signing his name to the truth. She held the before and the after simultaneously. She did not try to separate them. They were the same life, the same person. She had been that woman on the sidewalk in the cream coat, and she was this woman on the bench in the park in February. Both were true. Both were hers. She finally understood that the prison door had been unlocked all along. She had been her own warden. Not anymore. The prison had not been his house or his money or his social world. She could have left any of those. The prison had been her belief that leaving meant losing, that the life she had made inside his world was the only life she was capable of. She had believed that for 9 years. She knew it now for what it was, a lie she had told herself because it was easier than the truth, which was that she was capable of everything she needed to be capable of, and had been all along and had simply been standing with her back to the door, deciding the door was locked. She stood up. She released the brake on the stroller. She turned back toward home. Not the Lincoln Park house. The apartment in Bucktown with the green rug and the east window and the notebooks on the kitchen table. Home. March. 4 months after Maggie was born. The apartment smelled like coffee and the faint chemical clean of fresh paint that had not fully off-gassed from the second bedroom. The east window was doing what east windows do in March, letting in a light that was finally, unmistakably, the light of a season that had decided to change. Maggie was 4.5 months old. She had started smiling in the specific directed way that meant something. I see you. I know you. You are the one. She did it every morning when Claire came in, before Claire had fully registered being awake. She would turn her head at the sound of footsteps and find Claire's face, and the smile would come, complete and immediate and entirely genuine. Every morning, every single morning, Claire came in at 6:45. Maggie turned, found her face, smiled. Good morning, Claire said. She picked her up. She held her against her shoulder. The small weight, the specific warmth. Good morning. She carried her to the kitchen. She set her in the bouncy seat. She made coffee, 1 cup. She had not thought about it being 1 cup. Her hands simply knew. She drank the coffee standing at the east window. The March light came through at a lower angle than it would in April, but it was unmistakably different from February. Something had shifted. A degree or two. Enough. The settlement was finalized. The formal court proceedings had concluded the week before. $47 million in a structured settlement, the first transfer of which had arrived in an account that had her name on it. Just her name. She had looked at the bank statement. She had looked at the number. She had noted it. She had made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the east window. She had not celebrated. She had not performed any version of victory. She had just sat there and noted that the number was real and that it meant something specific. She was not going to have to worry about money for the rest of her life, and neither was Maggie, and she had not started with this number, and she had not built this number herself, and it was not the version of financial security she would have chosen, but it was what the law had given her, and the law had given it to her because she had contributed something real, and had been told the contribution did not matter, and had insisted that it did. That was what the number meant. That was enough. The Southside Housing Project had started. She drove there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The nonprofit's offices were in a converted storefront on a street that had the specific quality of a neighborhood that had been many things and was figuring out what to be next. She liked it. She was there to help it figure that out. The first meeting with the community had been the previous Friday. She had sat in a community room with 27 residents and listened for most of it. Listened to what the neighborhood actually was before she offered any thoughts about what it could become. This was the first skill, the foundational one. Listen before you draw. She had listened. She had driven home afterward and opened a new notebook and written for 2 hours. She thought about that. About the feeling of 2 hours disappearing because you were doing work that was real. She had forgotten what that felt like. She had been doing the work of managing someone else's life for 5 years. The work was real too. She had never not done it well, but it was not this. It was not the work of her own specific mind doing the thing her mind was built to do. She finished her coffee. She went to the second bedroom. She lifted Maggie out of the bouncy seat and carried her to the window. They looked out together. The March Street below. A woman walking with a small child who was insisting on walking faster than the woman considered safe. A man with a coffee cup moving with purpose in a specific direction. A delivery truck pulling up to the building across the way. There, Claire said, to Maggie quietly. All of them. All of their lives. She paused. We're going to be part of this street, this neighborhood. We're going to be here. Maggie considered the street with her complete attention. Grant was seeing Maggie on alternating weekends. The first visit had been awkward in the specific way of a father who loves his child and is not sure how to be around her yet. Claire had watched them through the window, him and Maggie in the Lincoln Park apartment he was renting, while the house was in the process of sale, and she had watched him learn how to hold her, tentatively, carefully, with the precise caution of someone who understands the weight of something they are not sure they have earned the right to hold. She had not watched with bitterness. She had watched with something more complicated, the hope that he would be what Maggie needed. Not what she needed. She was past needing anything from him except his absence from her life. But what Maggie needed. A father who showed up, who was present, who was the best version of himself in those hours. Hargrove Capital was under ongoing regulatory review. Grant had retained a modified operational role with full board oversight. His public reputation had absorbed a significant blow. The financial journalists were watching. He was going to be fine. She thought that clearly and without bitterness. He was going to be diminished and scrutinized and considerably less comfortable than he had been, and he was going to be fine. That was just the shape of it. She thought about Patricia Hargrove, who had called her once after the mediation to say 2 words, "Take care," and had hung up, which was, Claire had decided, the warmest thing Patricia Hargrove had ever said to her. She thought about Oliver Cross, who was managing his own legal process and who had in the end chosen self-preservation over loyalty. She could not decide whether that was admirable or not. She had stopped trying to decide. She thought about Helen, who was coming over for dinner on Saturday with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had been biting her tongue for years and was now allowed to say all of it. She thought about Dot, who had gone back to Ohio and called every other day and had begun asking questions about Chicago real estate with an enthusiasm that Claire recognized as portentous. She thought about the notebooks on the kitchen table. She thought about the green rug on the living room floor and the 2 second-hand chairs and the lamp she had bought new. She thought about this apartment and this window and this street and this beginning. We're okay, she said to Maggie, to the March morning, to herself. We're going to be okay. She believed it, not as a performance, not as the thing you say because you need to say something. As a fact she had verified. That evening, after Maggie was asleep, Claire sat in one of the second-hand chairs by the window. She had a book she had been meaning to read for 3 months. She had picked it up at a used bookstore 2 weeks ago. She had been meaning to read it. She kept not reading it because there was always something else. The notebooks, the project documents, the legal filings to review, the ordinary, accumulating business of her own life. She opened it. She read for 20 minutes. Then she set it in her lap. She looked around the room, the lamp, the green rug, the 2 chairs, the small side table. The east window, dark now with the street sounds below and the ambient light of a city that does not fully go dark. She could hear Maggie breathing through the monitor, in and out, steady, the most reliable sound in her world. She had something on the windowsill, a small succulent in a clay pot. She had bought it last week. She had not had a plant in years. The Lincoln Park house had had many plants, all of them managed by the housekeeper, all of them selected by a designer, all of them perfectly suited to their designated positions. This one was hers. She had chosen it herself from a rack outside a flower shop because she liked the shape of its leaves. She had brought it home and put it on the windowsill. She watered it when she remembered. She forgot sometimes and then remembered and watered it then. It was fine. It was a succulent. It was designed to survive the irregular attention of a person who is figuring out how to take care of their own things again. She looked at it. She thought about what it meant to keep something alive. Not the elaborate management of a curated household. Not the performance of caregiving. The simple, ordinary, unglamorous act of looking at something and knowing what it needed and providing it. She had been doing this for Maggie since November. She was learning to do it for herself. It was not dramatic. It was not triumphant. It was just daily, specific, hers. She picked up the book again. She read another 20 minutes. Then she set it down. She sat the apartment, the succulent on the windowsill, the monitor, the dark east window with the street sounds below. Whatever comes next, she said, not as a question, not with bravado, the quietest possible statement of the simplest possible truth. Whatever comes next. I'm ready. She sat in the lamplight for a while longer. She was in no hurry. She had nowhere to be. Tomorrow, the project meeting. The South Side street that was figuring out what to become. Her notebooks and her pen, and the specific language of her own mind doing the work it was built for. Tomorrow, Maggie turning her head at the sound of footsteps and finding Claire's face. The smile that came every morning. Tomorrow, coffee in one mug at the east window. The March light arriving at a degree or two different from February. Tomorrow, she got up. She put the book on the side table. She turned off the lamp. The room went to the ambient darkness of a window on a lit city street. Still visible, just different. She went to the window. She looked at the street below. The same woman from this morning, she thought it was the same woman walking back in the opposite direction, without the child now, moving at her own pace. Everyone at their own pace. She looked at the succulent on the sill. She touched one of the small, firm leaves with one finger. It was cool and slightly waxy, real alive, continuing on its own terms inside the window of a Bucktown apartment on a March evening. She had chosen it. She was going to keep it alive. That was, in its small and unglamorous way, exactly the right beginning. She turned from the window. She went to bed. The monitor breathed. In and out. The April that was not yet April but was almost. The city, continuing. Her daughter asleep in the next room. Her notebooks on the kitchen table. Her project. Her window. Her one cup waiting for morning. She was ready.